I left my leather briefcase here. Where is it? Richard Whitmore raised his voice, and the sound carried through the Bell and Finch Cafe, making several customers turn their heads. His eyes swept quickly over the rows of tables, moved toward the coffee counter, then stopped at the window booth where he had been sitting less than half an hour earlier. On a face that was usually calm and controlled, tension was now plain to see. The owner, Denise Bell, stepped out from behind the counter. She still wore a polite smile, but there was a trace of caution in her eyes. "Yes, sir," Denise said gently. "One of my employees found it." Richard's shoulders relaxed, but only for a moment. "She has it?" Denise turned her head and called toward the back of the counter, where the staff kept clean mugs and extra napkins. "Annie, bring out the leather briefcase, sweetheart. The gentleman has come back for it." A moment later, Annie Carter stepped out. She held the brown leather briefcase tightly against her chest with both arms, as if one careless movement might make the important thing disappear again. Her white apron was still tied neatly around her waist. A loose curl had fallen against her cheek after an entire morning of hurrying back and forth to serve customers. Annie walked over to Richard and offered him the briefcase with both hands. "Here it is, sir," she said softly. "I tried to run after you, but your car had already left." Richard took the briefcase at once. Relief spread across his face. He pulled it close to his chest and let out a long breath that sounded almost like a prayer. "Thank God," he whispered. But only a few seconds later, his eyes changed. Richard lowered the briefcase and began inspecting the brown leather. The brass latches, the handle, every corner, every small scratch. His fingers moved along the edges, then stopped at the lock. Then he looked at Annie. "You're sure you didn't open it?" Annie's lips parted, but for the first moment, no words came out. The question felt like a cold hand pressing against her chest. "No, sir," she answered quietly. "I didn't open it." Richard kept his hand on the clasp. "Not even to see who it belonged to?" Annie swallowed. "No, sir. When I cleared your table, I saw it on the seat. I picked it up and ran outside, but you were already gone. I brought it back in and left it behind the counter until you returned. I didn't search through anything." Denise stepped closer. The polite smile on her face was gone now. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Annie is telling you the truth. She is not the kind of girl who goes through other people's belongings." From the counter, a man sitting with a cup of coffee gave a dry little laugh. In front of him was a half-eaten biscuit. He wore a tan jacket, and his voice carried clearly, even though he had not spoken loudly. "If it were me, I'd still check." Denise turned sharply toward him. Earl shrugged and raised one hand as if he were innocent. "I'm just saying." A man walks out, leaves a leather briefcase behind, and comes back 20 minutes later. Best to check before he drives away. Once he's gone, that's the end of it. Annie lowered her head. Her fingers unconsciously found the edge of her apron, twisting the white fabric gently until she realized what she was doing and quickly let go. "I really didn't touch anything inside," she said. Earl glanced at her over the rim of his cup. "I didn't say you did." "Yes, you did," Denise answered at once. "No, ma'am," Earl said. "I said he should check. There's a difference." Denise's voice remained calm, but beneath it was the firmness of a woman who had spent too many long mornings protecting her employees from careless customers. "Not much of a difference when the girl standing right here is the one who found the briefcase and did the right thing." Earl set his cup down. "Good people get suspected every day. That's why folks check." Annie lifted her head. Her eyes were slightly red, but her voice still tried to remain respectful. "Sir, I know you don't know me, but I didn't open it. I would never do that." There was something in her voice that made even Earl fall silent for a moment. Richard heard it too. His expression softened. The sharpness at the corner of his mouth disappeared. He looked at the briefcase in his hand, then back at Annie, as if he were truly seeing the young woman in front of him for the first time. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I shouldn't have asked you that." Annie nodded once. "It's all right, sir." "No," Richard replied, his voice lower now. "It isn't." He placed the leather briefcase on the nearest table and opened the lock. Annie immediately turned her face away. She did not want to see anything private inside. But Richard had already reached into the briefcase, as if an idea had just come to him. "At least let me thank you properly," he said, "and make up for the way I spoke to you." Annie quickly shook her head. "You don't need to do that." "I want to." "Sir, I only returned what you left behind." Denise stood nearby, watching Richard carefully. Mr. Whitmore, she isn't asking for anything. I know, Richard said. That is exactly why I want to give her something. From the counter, Earl muttered. Well, I won't argue with that. Denise shot him a look. Earl, I swear if you don't finish that biscuit and keep your mouth shut. Richard paid no attention. He reached deeper into the briefcase, searching for his wallet or money clip among the folders. His movements were a little too quick, still mixed with relief and embarrassment. A file shifted. A leather-bound notebook slid across a stack of papers. A sealed envelope tilted to one side. Sir, Annie said, taking a small step back. Honestly, I don't need any money. Richard barely seemed to hear her. You saved me from a great deal of trouble. Not just money. I didn't do anything special. I only put it behind the counter. You did the right thing when many people would not have. Annie's cheeks flushed slightly. The compliment did not make her feel lighter. It felt heavy, because only moments ago, that same act of kindness had been placed under suspicion. Without thinking, she touched the silver bracelet on her wrist. On the inside of it were her name and date of birth. Annie Carter, June 14. Just then, Richard pulled out a small leather wallet that had been tucked beneath a stack of documents. The wallet caught on the edge of a folder. Before he could stop it, several things slipped out of the briefcase, scattered across the table, and fell to the floor. A pair of reading glasses, 2 envelopes, a small black notebook, and an old photograph. The photograph landed near the toe of Annie's shoe. Instinctively, she bent down to pick it up. You dropped this, sir. Her fingers closed around the edge of the picture. Then she turned it over. In the photograph, a young woman stood beside a much younger Richard Whitmore on the porch of a house overlooking a lake. The woman had a gentle smile, bright eyes, and hair that lifted softly in the wind. Annie froze. Her breath caught in her throat. She knew that face. Not just knew it. She had carried that face with her for years. Richard reached out to take the photograph back, but then he stopped when he saw the color drain from Annie's face. Annie did not return the picture right away. Her hand trembled. Slowly, she reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out her old wallet. From inside, she took out a worn photograph, its edges frayed, preserved so carefully that the paper had grown thin with the passing years. It was a photograph of her mother. Annie placed the 2 pictures side by side on the table. The entire cafe seemed to fall silent. Denise stepped closer, her voice softening. Annie? Annie did not answer. She only looked at Richard Whitmore. In her eyes now, there was no longer just the pain of being doubted. There was confusion, hope, fear, and an old wound suddenly touched after so many years. Her voice broke, so small it was almost only a breath. Why do you have a picture of my mother? That question seemed to pull every breath from Richard Whitmore's chest. He looked at the photograph Annie had just placed on the table. Then he looked at the old picture taken from her worn wallet. Then he looked at Annie. The 3 things lay before him like 3 pieces of a truth he had avoided, lost, or perhaps feared for more than 20 years. Denise stepped closer, her voice softening. Annie, sweetheart, are you sure? Annie nodded, but her eyes never left Richard. That is my mother, she said. Her name was Maya Carter. The moment that name was spoken, Richard's hand tightened around the edge of the table. Maya Carter. Just 2 words, yet they drained the color from his face. The familiar calm of the wealthy man vanished in an instant, revealing an old pain so deep that even he could not hide it in time. Maya, he whispered, almost without breath. Earl, the man still sitting at the coffee counter who always seemed to have something to say, finally fell silent. Annie carefully picked up her mother's photograph, as if one rough movement might tear the fragile paper in her hands. Why do you have a picture of my mother? Richard opened his mouth, but no answer came out. He looked again at the old photograph. In it, he was a much younger man, brighter and full of life, standing beside Maya on the porch of a house near the lake. Annie could clearly see the distance of time between the man in the picture and the man standing in front of her now, but his eyes had not changed. They were still the same eyes. You knew her, Annie said. Richard nodded once. Yes. Denise moved closer to Annie. She did not touch her, but her presence alone was enough to let Annie know she was not standing there alone. Mr. Whitmore, Denise said slowly, perhaps you should explain. Richard glanced around the cafe. A few customers sat perfectly still, their coffee cups paused halfway to their mouths. Some pretended to look out the window. but their ears were turned toward them. It seemed only then that Richard realized the room did not belong only to him and Annie. "This is not a conversation for a room full of people," he said. Annie lifted her chin slightly, not because she wanted to challenge him. It was simply the only way she could keep herself from falling apart. "You brought her photograph in here." Richard looked at her, then he nodded slowly, like a man accepting something he could not deny. "You're right." Annie put her mother's photograph back into her wallet, but she left Richard's picture on the table. "How did you know my mother?" Richard lifted a hand to his mouth, as if trying to wipe something away. Perhaps the tremble in his lips, perhaps a sob that had not yet formed. Then his eyes suddenly dropped to Annie's wrist. Her silver bracelet had slipped out from beneath her sleeve when she bent down to pick up the photograph. Only now did Richard see it. Truly see it. His voice changed. "May I look at that?" Annie immediately pulled her wrist closer to herself. "Why?" "The bracelet," Richard said. "Please." Denise spoke before Annie could answer. "She does not have to give you anything." "I know," Richard said, but his eyes remained fixed on the bracelet. "I only need to see the inscription inside." Annie felt as if her entire life were being pulled into the light. Slowly, she turned her wrist, just enough for Richard to read the inside of the silver bracelet. "Annie Carter, June 14. Richard choked on his breath. He reached for the back of a nearby chair, but he did not sit down. He simply stood there, staring at the tiny words as if they had knocked the strength out of him. "No," he whispered. "No, that cannot be." Annie's stomach tightened. "What cannot be?" Richard looked directly at her face. This time, he truly looked. Those eyes. That mouth. The way she stood tall even while wounded. The way she fought to keep her tears from falling. As if she had learned from childhood to hide pain deep inside her heart. He had seen that strength before. In the woman in the photograph. "Where did you get that bracelet?" he asked. "My mother left it to me." "Did she ever tell you who gave it to her?" Annie shook her head. "She died before she could tell me much." The sentence was short, but after saying it, Annie felt as if it had taken some of the last strength from her. Denise placed a hand on the edge of the table. "Annie, sweetheart, you don't have to keep answering everything." But Annie needed to know. She had lived too long with empty spaces, too long with questions no one answered, too long with an old photograph, a name, and a mother who existed only in other people's memories. "Why are you asking about my bracelet?" she asked. Richard's hand trembled as he reached into the leather briefcase again. This time, he was no longer hurried. He carefully moved the folders aside and took out the small black notebook. From the back pocket of the notebook, he pulled out a folded piece of paper, old and worn so thin at the creases that they had almost faded white. At first, he did not give it to Annie. He only looked at it. He looked at it as if that piece of paper had waited quietly for years just to force him to face everything. "I once had a bracelet made," he said. "A very long time ago. For a baby girl who had not yet been born." Annie felt Denise stiffen beside her. Richard continued, each word slower than the last. "The baby's mother wanted to name her Annie." Annie took a step back. "No." Richard's eyes reddened, but he did not reach for her. Perhaps he understood that, to Annie, he was still a stranger. And pain coming from a stranger could sometimes feel more frightening than silence. "I knew Maya Carter," he said hoarsely. "I loved her." Annie's face tightened. "Don't say that. It is the truth." "Then where were you?" The question came out sharper than Annie had meant it to. But once it was spoken, she did not want to take it back. For the first time since the photograph had fallen to the floor, Richard looked like a man who deserved to hear that question. "I searched for her," he said, "for years." Annie let out a small laugh, but there was no joy in it. It broke out of a place that hurt deeply. "You are Richard Whitmore. You could find a company on the other side of the world before lunchtime." From the counter, Earl muttered, "The girl has a point." One glance from Denise was enough to silence him. Richard did not defend himself. He lowered his head. "I know how that sounds." "No," Annie said. "You don't. You cannot know how it sounds from where I am standing." Richard was silent for a moment. Then he said softly, "You're right." Annie wanted him to argue. She wanted him to deny it. She wanted him to become the selfish kind of man she could hate immediately, because that would make everything easier. But he did not. He only stood there beside the open leather briefcase, with the old photograph lying between them. On his face was the pain of a man finally being forced to see the price of the life he had tried to survive. Denise turned to Annie. "Do you want me to call Sarah?" Annie nodded before she could pretend she was all right. Denise reached for the cafe phone. "Sit down for a minute, sweetheart." "I can't," Annie said by instinct. "I'm on shift." "Annie," Denise said gently. "Forget the shift." Annie looked toward the tables. Customers were waiting for more coffee. Sugar had spilled near table 2. A dirty plate still needed to be cleared. Those small, familiar tasks suddenly felt strangely comforting. Work had always been easier than feelings. Work told her what to do with her hands. Feelings only made her stand there, unsure how to breathe. Richard spoke very softly. "Annie, I am not asking you to believe me right now. If I were you, I would not believe me either." She looked at him. "But I'm asking you not to walk away before we know the truth." Annie touched the silver bracelet on her wrist. For years, that bracelet had made her feel as if her mother's hand were still wrapped around her wrist. But now, it suddenly felt like a key. A key she had carried her entire life without knowing there was a door waiting for it to open. "What truth?" she asked. Richard looked again at the date engraved on the bracelet. "If you were born on June 14, and Maya is your mother." His voice caught. He had to stop for a moment before he could continue. "Then it is very possible that you are my daughter." Annie's eyes blurred, but she fought to keep the tears from falling. She thought of Sarah at home, the woman who still kept coupons in an old coffee tin. She thought of Maya's photograph in her wallet. She thought of birthdays that had passed quietly, of years spent growing up with the feeling that some part of her had been left behind somewhere. Then she looked at Richard Whitmore, a man richer than the entire neighborhood where she lived. But at that moment, he stood before her looking more helpless than anyone she had ever seen. Finally, Annie whispered, "My mother never mentioned your name." Richard closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them again, tears had spilled down his face. Perhaps she had every reason not to. If Annie's story touched your heart, please like this video and let us know in the comments where you are watching from. Would you have believed Richard? Or would you have walked away? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to subscribe for more emotional stories about family, truth, and second chances. Denise returned, the phone still in her hand. Her voice was very careful. "Sarah is on her way." Annie nodded, but she could not speak. Richard quietly gathered the scattered papers back into the leather briefcase, but he left the old photograph on the table, between him and Annie. He simply stood there, facing the young woman who might be his daughter, while the whole life he had built began to shake before the only life he had ever lost. Annie looked down at the 2 photographs once more. One had been in her wallet for all those years. The other had been hidden inside his leather briefcase. Sarah Miller arrived at Bell and Finch faster than Annie thought she could. The front bell gave a small jingle, and Sarah stepped inside wearing the blue cardigan she usually saved for doctor appointments. Her hair was pulled back in a loose knot, and she had come in such a hurry that one side of her collar was tucked under. She looked first at Denise, then at Annie, then at Richard Whitmore standing beside the table with his leather briefcase open. "Annie," Sarah said, crossing the room. "Baby, what happened?" Annie moved toward her at once. The moment Sarah's arms came around her, Annie felt the strength leave her knees. She did not cry, not fully, but her breath shook against Sarah's shoulder. "I'm all right," Annie said, though she did not sound all right. Sarah held her face gently and checked her the way mothers do, even when there is no wound to see. "Denise said it was important. She said it was about Maya." Richard straightened when he heard Maya's name again. He looked at Sarah with a kind of careful respect, as if he understood that this woman had stood in a place he had not. "Mrs. Miller," he said, "my name is Richard Whitmore." "I know who you are," Sarah replied. Her voice was not rude, but it was not warm either. "What I don't know is why my girl is shaking in the middle of a coffee shop." Richard accepted the words without protest. "A photograph fell from my briefcase." Annie recognized the woman in it as her mother. Sarah's eyes went to the table. The 2 photographs were still there. One was Richard's, old but well kept. The other was Annie's, worn at the edges from years inside a wallet. Sarah picked up Annie's picture first, touching it with the care of someone who had seen it through many hard nights. Then she looked at Richard's photograph. Her mouth tightened. "That's Maya," she said. Richard nodded. "Yes." Sarah looked at him. "How long have you had this?" "Years. And you carried it around all this time?" Richard did not answer quickly. "Not every day, but I never threw it away." Sarah gave a short, painful breath. That sounds like something a man says when the woman isn't here to ask why he didn't do more. Annie looked down. Richard took the blow because there was no honest way to avoid it. You're right to ask. I'm not asking for myself, Sarah said. I'm asking because Maya isn't standing here. Denise moved behind the counter and began quietly telling customers that the cafe would be closing for a short while. Some paid and left without complaint. Earl lingered until Denise pointed at his cup. Take it with you, she said. I didn't say nothing. You said enough today. Earl lifted both hands, dropped cash beside his plate, and walked out, giving Annie a look that was almost an apology but not quite brave enough to become one. When the door closed behind the last customer, the cafe felt smaller. The street outside kept moving. But inside Bell and Finch there were only 5 people left. Annie, Sarah, Richard, Denise, and the assistant who had followed Richard in but now stood near the door, unsure whether he should speak. Richard turned to him. Caleb, wait outside. The assistant nodded and left. Sarah watched that happen. No lawyers? No lawyers, Richard said. No cameras? No. No one recording a poor girl's face so your people can manage the story later? Richard winced. No. Annie looked at Sarah. Mama Sarah. Sarah softened at the name. I'm not trying to scare you. I'm trying to make sure nobody else does. Richard closed the leather briefcase and kept both hands on top of it. I understand. Sarah's eyes moved to Annie's wrist. Did he see the bracelet? Annie nodded. Richard spoke quietly. I had one made for Maya's baby. Before she left, Sarah's face changed, but she did not give him the comfort of showing too much. Maya told me that bracelet was for Annie. She never said from who. She had every right not to. That's the first sensible thing you've said. Denise stood near the register, arms folded, not interfering but not leaving Annie alone either. Annie finally spoke. He says he might be my father. The words sounded strange outside her own mouth. Too large for the room. Too large for the girl who had spent her life filling coffee cups and counting coins for bus fare. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, they were wet but steady. Is that what you believe, Mr. Whitmore? Richard looked at Annie, not Sarah. I believe there's a real chance. Maya was pregnant when she left. She wanted to name the baby Annie. The date on the bracelet matches what I remember. His voice lowered. I don't want to force that truth on her. But I can't pretend I don't see it. Annie felt the room pressing in. She pulled her sleeve over the bracelet, not because she was ashamed of it, but because everyone looking at it made her feel bare. Sarah noticed and stepped closer. Then we take this slow. Richard nodded at once. Of course. Not your version of slow, Sarah said. Ours. Yes, ma'am. Annie looked up at him when he said that. There was no mockery in it, no impatience. Just a man who had entered a room believing he had lost a leather briefcase and had found a life he had no right to claim too quickly. Denise cleared her throat. My office is in the back. It's not fancy, but it's private. Y'all can sit there if Annie wants. Annie did not answer right away. Work felt safer. The counter, the cups, the orders, the small rules of a normal morning. If she walked into the back office with Richard Whitmore, normal would not return. Not today. Maybe not ever. Sarah touched her arm. You don't owe anybody a conversation right now. Richard added. She's right. That surprised Annie. She looked at him. I want answers, he said. But I've wanted things before and handled them badly. I won't do that to you. The honesty in that sentence made Annie's eyes burn. She picked up her mother's photograph and held it against her chest. I'll sit for 10 minutes. Sarah nodded. I'm coming with you. I was hoping you would, Annie said. Richard gathered his photograph from the table, then paused. May I bring this? Annie looked at the image of Maya beside him, young and smiling. Before life had made demands none of them were ready to pay. It's yours, Annie said. Richard's hand tightened around the edge of it. I'm not sure I deserve to say that. No one answered. Denise led them behind the counter, past the coffee urns and stacked plates, to a small office with a desk, 3 mismatched chairs, and boxes of paper cups along the wall. Annie sat between Sarah and the door. Richard noticed, and instead of choosing the chair closest to her, he took the one across the desk. For the first few seconds, nobody spoke. Then Sarah placed Annie's wallet photo on the desk. "Start with how you knew Maya," she said. Richard looked at the photograph, then at Annie. "I met her the summer I turned 32. She was working with a community housing program my family funded. I was supposed to give a speech and leave. Maya asked me a question in front of everyone that made half the room uncomfortable. Despite herself, Annie asked, 'What question?' Richard almost smiled, but it did not last. She asked why men with money called it charity when they gave away crumbs from tables other people helped build. Sarah let out a soft sound. That was Maya. Annie looked at her mother's face in the photograph and felt something shift. Not an answer. Not forgiveness. Just a door. Opening a crack. Richard's voice grew quieter. She was the first person in years who spoke to me like I was responsible for the space I took up. Annie held the bracelet beneath her sleeve. "And did you love her?" she asked. Richard looked directly at her. "Yes." "Then don't make it pretty," Annie said. "Tell me why she left." Richard sat across from Annie in Denise Bell's cramped back office, the old photograph resting between them on a desk crowded with receipt rolls and a cold cup of coffee. Sarah sat close to Annie, one hand folded over the other, her eyes fixed on Richard with the patience of a woman who had learned not to trust polished men too quickly. Richard looked at Maya's picture for a long moment before he spoke. "She left because I asked her to wait." Annie's face tightened. "That's not an answer." "No," he said. "It isn't. It's the part I used for years because the whole answer made me look worse." Sarah gave a small nod, not approving, only allowing him to continue. Richard rubbed his thumb along the edge of the photograph. "Maya was pregnant. I knew it. She told me in late September. We were in a parking lot behind a community center on Auburn Avenue after a fundraiser. She was scared, but not ashamed. That's what I remember most. She was scared of what my family would do, but she was not ashamed of me, not of herself, and not of the baby." Annie's hand moved to her bracelet under her sleeve. "I told her I loved her," Richard said, "and I did, but I also told her I needed time to handle my family." Sarah's mouth pressed into a hard line. "Handle." Richard accepted the word like a verdict. "Yes, that was the word I used, as if her dignity was a business matter." Annie looked at him. "What did your family say?" "My father said I was being reckless. My mother cried in a way that made everything about her. My sister Victoria said Maya would ruin the Whitmore name. The lawyers used softer words. Reputation, exposure, future claims, public misunderstanding." "Public misunderstanding?" Sarah said. "That's what they called a woman carrying your baby?" Richard's eyes lowered. "Yes. And you let them?" "I did." The room went still, but not peacefully. Annie felt heat rise in her chest. Part of her wanted him to give excuses, something she could strike away. Instead, he kept giving her facts, and each one made the picture worse. Richard continued. "I told Maya I would fix it. I told her I just needed a few weeks. She asked me one question." "What?" Annie asked. She asked whether I was asking her to wait because I had a plan, or because I was afraid. Annie swallowed. "What did you say?" "I said I had a plan." "And did you?" Richard shook his head. "No, I had fear dressed up as patience." Sarah let out a quiet breath. "Maya would have heard that." "She did," Richard said. "She knew before I did." Annie took her mother's photograph from the desk and held it in both hands. The woman in the picture looked young, alive. Impossible to fit inside the few stories Annie had been given. "Did she ask you to choose?" Richard's answer came slowly. "No, that would have been easier. She asked me to stand beside her. Not in a month. Not after lawyers finished talking. Then." "And you didn't?" "No." Annie nodded once, but it was not agreement. It was a way to keep herself from breaking apart in front of him. So she left. "The next morning," Richard said, "I went to her apartment. It was empty. Not messy. Not rushed. Empty. She had taken what she needed and left the rest. I found a blue scarf on the back of a chair. I kept it for years." Sarah's eyes sharpened. "You found a scarf but not the woman?" Richard looked at her. "I hired people. I checked addresses. I called clinics. I searched. I know that sounds worthless sitting here now." "It doesn't sound worthless," Sarah said. "It sounds late." Annie closed her eyes for a second. Late. That was the word. Late rent, late buses, late apologies, late truth. Her life had been built around things arriving after they were needed. "Why didn't she ever tell me your name?" Annie asked. Richard's voice softened. "Maybe because my name hurt her." Annie opened her eyes. "Or maybe because she didn't want me waiting for a man who had already made her wait." Richard flinched, but he did not look away. "That may be true." Sarah turned slightly toward Annie. "Baby, you don't have to take all this in right now." "I know," Annie said, though she did not know. Her body was still in the cafe office, but her mind was running through every birthday, every school form with a blank space, every time another girl had said, "My dad," as if it were the easiest phrase in the world. Richard noticed her hand near the bracelet. "May I ask something?" Annie's eyes narrowed. "You can ask. Did Maya ever talk about me at all?" Annie looked at Sarah. Sarah answered for her. "Not by name. She said Annie's father was a man with a good heart and weak knees." Richard closed his eyes. Sarah went on, her voice steady. "She said that once when she was sick and thought I was asleep in the chair beside her bed. I never repeated it because I didn't think it was my place." Annie turned to Sarah. "You never told me that." "I know. Why? Because a half-truth can make a person hungrier than no truth at all." Annie looked back at Richard. "My mother died with bills on the table. Did you know that?" "No. She worked when she was tired. She smiled when she didn't have enough. Sarah helped her. Neighbors helped her. People who had almost nothing helped her." Annie's voice shook, but she kept going. "You had everything." Richard's hands tightened together. "I know. No, you don't. You know numbers. You know searches. You know what you paid people to do. You don't know what it felt like for her." "You're right. Stop saying that." He fell silent. Annie wiped her cheek quickly, angry at the tear before it could fall far. "I don't want money from you. I didn't come to offer money. You tried to give me cash 5 minutes ago." Richard looked ashamed. "Because I was embarrassed and grateful, and I reached for the easiest thing I understood. That was wrong too." Sarah studied him. "At least you know it." A knock came at the office door. Denise opened it just enough to look in. "Annie? You need anything?" Annie shook her head. "No, ma'am." Denise glanced at Richard. "You folks take the time you need. Cafe can wait." When the door closed, Richard reached into the leather briefcase again, slower this time. Annie stiffened. He noticed and stopped. "I'm not taking out money." "What then?" He removed the folded paper from the black notebook and placed it on the desk without pushing it toward her. "This is the receipt for the bracelet. I kept it in that notebook. I don't know why. Maybe because throwing it away felt like admitting I had no right to remember." Annie looked at the paper but did not touch it. Richard said, "The jeweler wrote the engraving on the order form. Annie Carter. June 14th. Maya chose the name. I only paid for the silver." Sarah's voice was quiet. "Maya kept it wrapped in blue cloth." Richard's mouth trembled. She used to wrap important things in blue. That small detail struck Annie harder than the bigger claims. It was too specific. Too ordinary. The kind of thing only someone who had been close to Maya would know. Annie reached for the paper. The writing was faded, but the name was there. Annie Carter, her name, written before she ever drew breath. She pushed the receipt back as if it had burned her. "I need air." Sarah stood with her at once. Richard started to rise, then stopped himself. Annie paused at the door and turned back. "Don't follow me." "I won't," he said. She stepped out into the narrow hallway behind the cafe, past shelves of coffee filters and boxes of paper cups, and pushed open the back door to the alley. The morning air was cool against her face. She pressed one hand over the bracelet and tried to breathe. Behind her, Sarah came out and stood beside her without speaking. After a while, Annie whispered, "What if it's true?" Sarah looked down the alley toward the slice of Atlanta sky between brick buildings. Then truth came late. Annie's eyes filled again. "What am I supposed to do with late?" Sarah slipped an arm around her shoulders. "You don't have to know today." Inside the office, Richard remained seated with Maya's photograph on the desk and the leather briefcase at his feet. For the first time in many years, all his money had no use at all. Annie stayed in the alley until the cold had settled into her fingers. Sarah stood beside her the whole time, one arm around her shoulders. saying nothing unless Annie moved first. That was how Sarah loved. She did not crowd pain. She made room for it, then stood guard. Inside the cafe, someone moved a chair. A truck passed on the street beyond the building. Atlanta went on doing what cities do, carrying people to work, appointments, errands, and breakfasts they would forget by noon. Annie felt angry at that, though she knew it made no sense. Her life had cracked open in the back of a coffee shop. And outside, the traffic lights kept changing. "I can't go back in there," Annie said. "You don't have to. I have a shift." Sarah gave her a look. "Denise already closed the dining room for you. She'll survive 30 minutes without you wiping tables." Annie gave a small sound that almost became a laugh, but it broke before it could live. "He said my name was written before I was born." Sarah's arm tightened a little. "I heard. Did Mama ever tell you she wanted to name me Annie?" "Yes." Annie turned to her. "You knew that?" "I knew Maya chose your name. I didn't know he knew it too." That answer seemed to make the alley tilt. Annie pressed her palm over the bracelet. "Then maybe he isn't lying." "No," Sarah said. "Maybe he isn't." Annie wished Sarah would say the opposite. She wished Sarah would call Richard Whitmore a liar, and take her home, make tea, turn off the phones, and lock the world outside. But Sarah had never protected Annie with false comfort. Not when the power bill was late. Not when Maya's old photograph made Annie cry in middle school. Not when other girls had fathers in the bleachers and Annie had Sarah clapping twice as loud to fill the empty space. "What happens now?" Annie asked. Sarah looked at the back door. "Now we decide what we can handle today. Not tomorrow, not the whole story, just today. I don't want to sit in there while he tells me he loved her." "Then don't. I want to know." "That's different." Annie wiped her cheeks with the heel of her hand. "I hate that I want to know." Sarah turned her gently. "Wanting answers doesn't mean you owe him forgiveness." The back door opened, and Denise stepped halfway into the alley. She did not ask if everything was all right. She knew better. "Richard is still in the office. He hasn't moved. Said he'll leave if Annie wants him gone." Annie looked past Denise toward the hallway. "Did he say that?" "He did." Sarah asked. "Is anybody out front?" "No." "I put a note on the door saying we had a plumbing issue." Denise shrugged. "Closest lie I could manage on short notice." Despite everything, Annie smiled faintly. Denise's face softened. "Honey, you don't have to be brave for us." "I don't know how not to be." Nobody answered that. Some truths landed better without witnesses. Annie drew a breath and stepped back inside. The hallway smelled of coffee grounds and cardboard. Each step toward the office felt heavier than the one before it. When she entered, Richard was exactly where she had left him, seated across from the desk with his hands folded, the leather briefcase closed near his chair. He stood when she came in, then seemed to think better of it and stayed still. "I can go," he said. Annie sat down beside Sarah. "No. I need to ask you something." "Anything." She took her mother's photograph from the desk. "Did she leave because you didn't love her, or because you were ashamed of her?" Richard's face tightened. "I was never ashamed of Maya, but your family was." "Yes." "And you let that matter?" He looked down at the desk. "Yes." Annie nodded slowly, as if filing the word in a place where it could hurt later. "My mother died without ever telling me your name. She let me carry a bracelet you bought, but she didn't give me the man who bought it. That means something." "It does. What does it mean to you?" Richard took a long breath. "It means I hurt her badly enough that even when she kept one thing from me, she kept me away from you." Sarah leaned back a little, watching him. Annie's voice stayed low. "Did you marry somebody else?" "Yes." "Did she know about my mother?" Richard paused. She knew there had been someone before her. She knew I had spent years looking for a woman named Maya. She did not know there might have been a child. "Why not?" "Because by the time I married, the search had gone cold. I told myself maybe Maya had wanted a life without me. I told myself I was respecting her silence." Sarah's expression hardened. Men love calling a woman's pain silence when it helps them sleep. Richard did not defend himself. "You're right." Annie looked at Sarah, then back at him. "Is your wife still alive?" "No," he said quietly. "She passed away 3 years ago." There was no triumph in Annie when she heard it, no satisfaction. Only a strange sadness. Grief did not cancel grief. Loss did not make a person innocent, but it made the room more human. "I'm sorry," Annie said, because Sarah had raised her to say what was decent even when her heart was confused. Richard looked at her with surprise, then gratitude he seemed ashamed to show. "Thank you." Denise, still near the door, cleared her throat. "I can make coffee. Or tea." Nobody thinks straight on an empty stomach. Sarah gave her a tired smile. "Tea would be good." "Annie?" Annie shook her head. "No, ma'am." Denise left, and the office settled again. Richard reached toward the leather briefcase, then stopped and looked at Annie first. "May I?" She nodded, wary. He opened it and removed a business card. But instead of handing it to her like a man closing a deal, he placed it on the desk where she could choose whether to touch it. "This is my private number, not my office, not my assistant." Annie did not pick it up. Richard continued, "I would like to arrange a DNA test, but only if you agree. I'll pay for it. You can choose the clinic. You can have Mrs. Miller with you. Denise too, if that makes you feel safer." Annie looked at the card. Richard Whitmore. The letters were plain, black on thick cream paper. It looked like something from a world that had never had to wait for a bus in the rain. "And if I say no?" she asked. "Then I leave you alone." "Just like that?" "No," he said honestly. "Not inside myself. But yes, in your life." Sarah watched him for a moment. "That sounds practiced." "It isn't." "Good, because she doesn't need a speech. She needs time." "I understand." Annie picked up the card at last, not because she trusted him, but because refusing to hold it would not make the question disappear. "I don't know what I want." "You don't have to." She almost laughed at that, not because it was funny, but because adults had been telling her what she did not have to do all morning, while the truth kept pulling her forward anyway. Denise returned with 2 paper cups of tea and a biscuit wrapped in a napkin. She set the biscuit in front of Annie. "Don't argue." Annie looked at it. "I'm not hungry." "Didn't ask." Sarah nudged the biscuit closer. "Eat a little." Annie broke off a piece because it was easier than fighting kindness. Richard stood slowly. "I should go." Annie looked up fast, surprised by the panic that rose in her. She was not ready for him to stay, but she was not ready for him to vanish either. Richard seemed to read only enough of her face to speak carefully. "I'm not disappearing, but I don't want to take any more from you today." Sarah nodded. "That's wise." He closed the leather briefcase and picked it up. At the office door, he turned back to Annie. "Your mother deserved better from me." Annie held the biscuit in both hands, unable to answer. Richard's voice lowered. "So do you." Then he left the office, walked through the closed cafe, and out into the Atlanta morning with the leather briefcase at his side. Annie sat very still until the front bell finished its small sound. Then she looked at Sarah. "If the test says he's my father," she whispered, "does that change who I am?" Sarah reached across the desk and covered Annie's hand with hers. "No, baby. It changes what you know, not who you are." Annie looked down at the bracelet on her wrist, then at the business card lying beside her mother's photograph. For the first time, the name she had never known was not a blank space. It was a man who had just walked out the door, carrying a leather briefcase that had brought him back too late and somehow exactly on time. For the rest of that day, Annie kept Richard Whitmore's card inside her wallet, behind the photograph of Maya, where she could feel its stiff edge whenever she reached for her bus pass. She hated that she noticed it. She hated that a small cream-colored card could make her hands unsteady while she poured coffee, counted change, and smiled at customers who had no idea her whole morning had split in two. Denise did not ask her to finish the shift, but Annie stayed anyway. She wiped tables that were already clean, refilled napkin holders, and carried plates to customers who had missed the drama and only wanted lunch. Work gave her a reason to move. Work did not ask what it meant if a billionaire had bought the bracelet on her wrist before she was born. Sarah sat in the corner booth for almost an hour, sipping tea she did not seem to taste. Every few minutes, Annie looked over to make sure she was all right. Sarah would lift 2 fingers from the cup, a quiet sign that said, "I'm here." By late afternoon, Bell and Finch returned to its usual rhythm. Denise unlocked the front door. Earl came back for a refill he did not deserve, and left a $5 bill under his mug without saying a word. Annie saw it and almost smiled. When her shift finally ended, Denise walked her to the back counter. "You don't come in tomorrow unless you want to. I need the hours. I know you do." I'm telling you, I'll put you down as paid. Annie shook her head. Miss Denise, I can't let you do that. Denise placed both hands on the counter. Annie Carter, I have watched you cover shifts for people who never thanked you. I have watched you bring soup to Mrs. Donnelly when she had the flu and pretend it was extra from the kitchen. Let somebody be kind to you without making it a debt. Annie looked down. Yes, ma'am. And call me if that man sends anybody to your house. He said he wouldn't. Men say many things when they're sorry. Sarah, who had come to stand beside Annie, gave a tired nod. That part is true. They rode home in silence on the bus. Atlanta passed outside the window in pieces. Brick storefronts, church signs, gas stations, office towers catching the last light. People waiting at crosswalks with grocery bags and phones in their hands. Annie sat close to Sarah and kept her right hand over the bracelet. At home, the apartment felt too small for what had happened. The kitchen table still held the morning's mail, a half-used roll of paper towels, and Sarah's pill organizer. Nothing had changed, which somehow made everything worse. Sarah filled the kettle. Tea? Annie nodded, though she did not want any. She took Richard's card from her wallet and placed it on the table beside Maya's photograph. Sarah sat across from her, moving slowly, her breath short from the stairs. You don't have to decide tonight, Sarah said. I know. You keep saying that like knowing helps. Annie touched the corner of Maya's picture. What if I take the test and it says he's not my father? Then you'll know. And if it says he is? Sarah folded her hands. Then you'll know that too. Annie gave her a tired look. You make it sound simple. No, I make it sound survivable. The kettle began to sing softly. Sarah got up before Annie could stop her. She poured hot water over 2 tea bags and set 1 cup in front of Annie. Annie did not drink. Do you think Mama hated him? Sarah stayed by the counter for a moment. No. How can you know? Because hate makes a person speak. Maya kept quiet. That was pain, not hate. Annie let that settle. Did she love him? Sarah came back to the table. Yes. The answer hurt more than Annie expected. Then why didn't she tell me? Maybe she wanted you to have peace. I didn't have peace. I had questions. Sarah reached across the table, but Annie pulled her hand back, then felt guilty for doing it. Sarah did not look offended. She simply let her hand rest there between them. I'm sorry, Annie whispered. You don't owe me sorry for being upset. Annie picked up Richard's card. The private number sat beneath his name. No office line, no assistant, no company title. Just a number he had chosen to give her. I want to hear his voice again, she admitted, and I hate that too. Sarah nodded. Then call. Put it on speaker. Annie looked at the clock on the stove. It was a little after 7. She imagined Richard in some high room downtown, surrounded by glass, leather chairs, and people who spoke quietly because money had taught them they did not need to raise their voices. Then she imagined him alone, with Maya's photograph on a desk. Her thumb hovered over the number for nearly a minute before she pressed call. He answered on the second ring. Annie? The way he said her name made her close her eyes. Not familiar enough to be a father, not distant enough to be a stranger. Yes, she said. It's me. Sarah's here too. You're on speaker. Mrs. Miller, Richard said. Sarah answered. Mr. Whitmore. There was a small pause. Annie spoke before the silence could grow teeth. I'll do the DNA test. Richard let out a breath. Thank you. I'm not doing it for you. I understand. I want to choose the clinic. Of course. And Sarah comes with me. Yes. And Miss Denise can know where I am. Yes. And I don't want your lawyers calling me. They won't. If anyone from your office comes to my apartment, I'm done. No one will. Annie looked at Sarah, who gave a small nod. Richard's voice came through quieter. Would tomorrow be too soon? Annie's fingers tightened around the phone. Tomorrow felt too fast. Tomorrow also felt like a door she could not keep standing in front of. What time? She asked. There's a clinic near Midtown. Private, but ordinary. No press, no office staff. I can send the address, and you can check it yourself. Sarah leaned closer. We'll check it. I expected that, Richard said. Annie almost asked if he was scared. She stopped herself, then asked anyway. Are you hoping it says yes? The line went quiet. Yes, Richard said at last. And I'm ashamed to say that out loud. Because if it says yes, it means you grew up without me. Annie swallowed. At least you know that. I do. Sarah looked at Annie with the kind of sadness that had no easy place to go. Annie said, "Tomorrow at 10. Send the address." "I will." "And Mr. Whitmore?" "Yes." "Don't bring flowers. Don't bring gifts. Don't bring money." "I won't. Just bring the truth." His answer came slowly. "I'll bring what I have. I'm afraid some of it won't be enough." Annie looked at Maya's photograph on the table. "It already isn't." She ended the call before he could respond. For a long moment, neither she nor Sarah moved. Then Sarah reached over and covered Annie's hand. "That was hard," Sarah said. Annie nodded. "You did it anyway." Annie looked at the bracelet on her wrist, then at the phone, then at the photo of the mother who had left behind a name, a date, and a question no one had been brave enough to answer. Tomorrow, a test would not heal anything, but it would stop the guessing. By 9 the next morning, Annie had changed shirts 3 times and still felt wrong in her own skin. She finally chose a plain blue blouse Sarah had ironed the night before, not because it made the day easier, but because Maya had liked blue. Annie did not say that out loud. Sarah knew anyway. "You don't have to dress for him," Sarah said from the kitchen table, where she was checking the clinic address Denise had written down after calling a friend who worked at a dental office nearby. "I'm not." Sarah looked at her over the top of her glasses. Annie sighed, maybe a little. "That's honest." Annie touched the bracelet on her wrist. She had thought about taking it off, then felt ashamed for even considering it. The bracelet had been with her through bus rides, job interviews, bad birthdays, and nights when Sarah's cough would not let either of them sleep. If Richard Whitmore was going to sit across from her while strangers tested their blood, he could see what Maya had left behind. Denise arrived at 9, 20 inches her old Ford, refusing to let them take the bus. "No arguments," she said when Annie opened the apartment door. "I told the morning crew I had an appointment," which is true enough. "You two ready?" Sarah picked up her purse, as ready as people get for something like this. The clinic sat on a quiet street near Midtown, tucked between a physical therapy office and a place that sold hearing aids. It was clean without being grand. No cameras, no guards in suits, no sign that a man with Richard Whitmore's money had arranged anything except privacy. Richard was already in the waiting area when they arrived. He stood as soon as Annie entered, then stopped himself from stepping forward. He wore a dark suit, but no tie. His leather briefcase rested beside his chair. The sight of it made Annie's stomach tighten. "Good morning," he said. Sarah answered first. "Morning." Denise gave him a short nod. "Mr. Whitmore, Miss Bell, thank you for coming. I came for Annie." "I know." Annie stayed near Sarah. "Did you bring anyone?" "No," Richard said. "No assistant, no lawyer, just me." A nurse opened the inner door and called their names. Richard gestured for Annie to go first. She did, not because he offered, but because she wanted the hallway behind her, not him. The process was ordinary in a way that felt almost cruel. A clipboard, a consent form, a photo ID, a cotton swab inside the cheek. The nurse explained the lab would compare the samples and send results in a few business days, unless Richard had paid for expedited processing. Annie looked at him. He cleared his throat. "I did. I'm sorry. I thought waiting longer would be hard." "It is," Annie said, "but you should have asked." "You're right." The nurse looked between them and wisely said nothing. Annie signed her form with a hand that would not quite settle. When she handed it back, the nurse smiled gently. "That's all we need from you." "That's all?" Annie asked. "That's all." It should have felt too small. A few swabs in plastic tubes, labels printed by a machine, signatures on paper. Not enough to carry Maya's silence. Not enough to measure all the mornings Annie had wondered why half her story was missing. Yet the nurse sealed the samples in a small bag as if the truth could fit inside it. Outside the clinic, Denise offered to drive Annie and Sarah home, but Richard asked if he could say one thing first. Annie looked at Sarah. Sarah did not answer for her. "One thing," Annie said. Richard stood near the curb, hands open at his sides. "I know this test may answer one question. It won't answer the ones that matter most. I know that." Annie studied his face. "Do you?" "I'm trying to. That's not the same." "No," he said. It isn't. Denise shifted beside Sarah, ready to cut the conversation short if Annie needed it. Richard continued. If the result says what I think it may say, I won't ask you to change your life overnight. Annie gave a small, tired laugh. It already changed. I know. No, Mr. Whitmore. You found an old picture and a bracelet. I found out my whole life might have had a father with a name, a house, a car waiting outside coffee shops, and enough money to hire people to look. That is not the same morning for us. Richard took that in without moving. No, it isn't. Annie wanted to hate how easily he admitted fault. It gave her nowhere clean to place her anger. Sarah touched her elbow. Come on, baby. The next 3 days moved slowly. Annie went to work because bills did not pause for family secrets. Customers came in with the usual requests. Black coffee, extra cream, no onions in the egg sandwich, a muffin warmed for 10 seconds. Denise kept Earl away from the counter when Annie was near. Earl, to his credit, left money in the tip jar every day and stopped offering opinions. But the world outside Bell and Finch had begun to notice. Someone had posted a short video from the first morning. It did not show everything. Only Richard holding the leather briefcase, Annie standing in her apron, and Denise stepping between them. The caption was worse than the video. Billionaire's missing briefcase found by cafe waitress. Emotional scene inside Atlanta coffee shop. By the second day, people online had invented stories from nothing. Some said Annie had saved important documents. Some said Richard had rewarded her with thousands of dollars. Some said she had set the whole thing up. Annie stopped reading after one comment asked whether her mother had known rich men too. She closed her phone and put it face down. Denise found her in the stockroom, standing between boxes of paper cups. You saw it, Denise said. Annie nodded. People with no manners got the loudest fingers. I know. Knowing doesn't make it sting less. Annie pressed her lips together. They don't even know my mother. No, they don't. That evening, Sarah made soup, though neither of them ate much. Annie kept checking her phone, then hating herself for checking. Around 7:40, Richard called. Annie put it on speaker. Yes? The clinic sent the result, he said. His voice was careful, and that told her before the words came. Sarah reached for Annie's hand. Richard continued. They sent it to both of us. I didn't want to open mine until you had yours. Annie looked at her email. A message from the clinic sat at the top of the screen. Her thumb hovered. Sarah whispered, I'm right here. Annie opened it. The document was short. Too short. Names. Case number. Probability. Conclusion. She read the line 3 times before her mind accepted it. Richard Whitmore could not be excluded as the biological father of Annie Carter. Probability of paternity. 99.9998%. The phone slipped from her hand onto the table. Sarah covered her mouth. Richard's voice came through small from the speaker. Annie? She could not answer. All her life, the empty space beside her name had been a fog. Now it had a face, a voice, a number on a page. She thought it would make her feel whole. Instead, it made her feel split open. Richard spoke again, his voice breaking. I'm so sorry. Annie looked at Maya's photograph propped against the sugar jar. You're my father, she said. But the words did not feel like they were coming from her. Yes, Richard whispered. I am. Sarah began to cry quietly. Not from joy exactly. Not from grief exactly, but from the strange mercy and cruelty of truth arriving together. Annie picked up the phone with unsteady fingers. I need to go. I understand. No, she said, sharper than she meant. You don't. Not yet. She ended the call and sat very still. Sarah moved beside her and wrapped both arms around her. Annie let herself be held. For years, she had imagined answers as doors opening. She had not imagined that behind the door there might be another hallway, longer than the first. After a while, Sarah whispered, You are still Annie Carter. Annie nodded against her shoulder, crying now. On the table, the clinic result glowed on her phone beside Maya's photograph and the silver bracelet on her wrist. The test had ended the guessing, but it had begun something harder. Now Annie had a father, and she had to decide what that word was allowed to mean. The next morning, Annie did not go to Bell and Finch. Denise had already told her not to come in, and for once Annie did not argue. She sat at the kitchen table with Sarah's old laptop open in front of her, reading the clinic result again though the words had not changed. Richard Whitmore was her biological father. The sentence looked official, clean, and impossible to fight. Sarah set a plate of toast beside her. "Eat. I'm not hungry. You said that yesterday." "I meant it yesterday too." Sarah pushed the plate closer. "One bite, then you can keep falling apart." Annie looked up despite herself. "That's your comfort? That's my parenting. Comfort comes after calories." Annie tore off a small piece of toast and put it in her mouth. It tasted like nothing. Her phone sat near the sugar jar, face down. Richard had not called again. He had sent one message late the night before. "I will wait until you are ready. I am here." Annie had read it 6 times and answered none. By noon, Sarah's breathing had grown rougher, and Annie used the quiet work of making soup to keep her hands busy. She chopped carrots, stirred broth, washed the same spoon twice. Every ordinary motion felt like it had been done by another version of her. The one who had not yet seen a number on a lab report turn a stranger into her father. At 1:15, her phone rang. Richard Whitmore. Sarah looked at the screen, then at Annie. "You want me to answer?" Annie shook her head. "No, I'll do it." She put the call on speaker because she needed Sarah's presence in the room. "Hello, Annie," Richard said. He sounded tired. "Thank you for taking the call. I didn't say I was ready." "I know. What do you want?" "To ask if I may see you. You and Mrs. Miller. Not today if that is too much." Annie looked at Sarah. Sarah gave nothing away. "Why?" Annie asked. "Because there are legal steps, medical records, things you deserve access to. But more than that, I want to show you what I have from Maya. Not to pressure you, to answer what I can." Annie's hand moved to her bracelet. "Where?" "My home." The answer made her stomach tighten. Richard seemed to hear the silence. "You can say no." Sarah leaned closer to the phone. "Why your home, Mr. Whitmore?" "Because some of the records are there. And because my sister will need to be told before the press does more damage." Annie frowned. "Your sister?" "Victoria." Sarah's eyes sharpened. "Does Victoria know about Annie?" "Not yet. She knows something happened at the cafe. She has called me 11 times since last night." "That sounds like her problem," Sarah said. "It is," Richard replied. "But if I don't tell her myself, she will learn it from someone else and start making decisions without me." Annie heard the warning under his words. "Decisions about me? No one has the right to make decisions about you." "That's not what I asked." Richard was quiet for a second. "Yes. About you. About how to handle the public story. About the family name. About money." Annie's face warmed. "I don't want your money. I know. But people around me will assume money is the only question," Sarah muttered. "People around money usually do." Richard did not object. "I can send a car, or you can come however you prefer." Annie almost said she would take the bus, just to prove he could not carry her into his world on leather seats and tinted windows. But Sarah had coughed twice since the call began, and the Whitmore house was across town. "We'll come," Annie said, "but Denise gets the address." "Of course. And if I want to leave, I leave." "Yes. And no reporters." "No reporters," Sarah added, "and no lawyer sitting there waiting to hand her papers." Richard's answer came firm. No lawyer. 2 hours later, a black sedan pulled up outside the apartment building. Annie saw it from the window, and just it were less noticeable. A few neighbors looked from porches and upstairs blinds. Mrs. Alvarez from 2B lifted her eyebrows but said nothing. Sarah wore her blue cardigan again. Annie wore jeans, a clean blouse, and the silver bracelet uncovered. She slipped Maya's photograph into her wallet, then took it out and held it for a moment. Sarah saw. "Bring her with you." Annie put the photo back. The driver opened the rear door without speaking too much. Annie appreciated that. The car smelled faintly of leather and mint. Sarah sat beside her, purse gripped in her lap, back straight. As Atlanta shifted from small storefronts and apartment blocks to wide streets and gated drives, Annie felt each mile like a hand pulling her farther from the life she understood. Richard's home sat behind an iron gate north of the city. set back from the road behind trimmed hedges and old trees. It was not simply large. It was arranged to make visitors feel they had entered a place where history had been polished and hung on the walls. Annie stepped out of the car and looked at the stone steps, the tall windows, the heavy front door. For a second, she thought of Sarah's apartment, the uneven table, the kettle that whistled too loudly, the medicine bottles lined by the sink. She felt protective of that little home all at once, as if this house might try to make it seem less worthy. Richard opened the door himself. "Thank you for coming," he said. Annie did not answer. Sarah gave a small nod. Inside, the entry hall was cool and quiet. Framed portraits lined one wall. Silver-haired men in dark suits. Women in pearls. No Maya. No one who looked like Annie. She noticed that at once, and hated that it hurt. Richard led them into a sitting room with low chairs and shelves filled with books that looked untouched. A tray of coffee and tea sat on the table. "I wasn't sure what you drink," he said. Sarah said, "Tea is fine." Annie stayed standing. "Where is Victoria?" Richard's jaw shifted. On her way, as if called by the words, heels sounded from the hall. A woman entered wearing cream slacks and a pale sweater, her hair cut neatly at her shoulders. She looked enough like Richard for Annie to recognize the family line, but there was a coldness in her eyes that Richard did not have. "Richard," Victoria said, "you refused my calls all morning. Then I hear from Caleb that you brought guests to the house." Her eyes moved to Sarah first, then Annie. They paused on Annie's bracelet, then on her shoes, her blouse, her face. Richard's voice was calm. "Victoria, this is Annie Carter. This is Sarah Miller." Victoria offered no hand. "I see." Annie felt Sarah shift beside her. Richard continued. "The DNA test came back last night. Annie is my daughter." The room held the words without softening them. Victoria blinked once. "That is a serious claim." "It is not a claim, it is a result. I assume you had independent counsel review it." Annie spoke before Richard could. "I picked the clinic." Victoria turned to her. "Did you?" "Yes, ma'am." The polite answer seemed to irritate Victoria more than rudeness would have. "And before this week, you had no contact with my brother?" "No. But you knew who he was." "I knew his name from TV, that's all." Victoria's mouth formed something close to a smile, but without kindness. "How convenient." Sarah set her purse down on the chair. "Careful." Victoria looked at her. "Excuse me?" Sarah's voice stayed even. "You heard me." Richard stepped between them with his voice, not his body. "Victoria, Annie did not come here to be questioned." "Then why is she here?" "Because from where I stand, a girl from a cafe appears with a bracelet and a story, and overnight you are ready to rewrite the family." Annie felt the words strike, but she did not lower her head. Richard's face hardened. "She appeared because I left my leather briefcase behind and she returned it." Victoria looked at the case near Richard's chair. "And I suppose no one found that timing strange?" Sarah took one step forward. "My Annie returned what he forgot. That is the whole of it." Victoria's eyes moved over Sarah. "Your Annie?" "Yes," Sarah said. "Mine in every way that matters when someone needs feeding, raising, and sitting beside in emergency rooms." For the first time, Victoria had no quick answer. Annie looked at Richard. "Is this why you wanted me here?" "No," he said. And there was anger now. Quiet but real. "I wanted you here because you deserve the truth. Victoria is giving you a clear view of what Maya faced." Victoria's face tightened. "Do not bring that woman into this room as if she was some injured saint." Annie's voice came out low. "Her name was Maya Carter." Victoria turned back to her. Annie's hand closed around the bracelet. "If you're going to insult my mother, you can at least say her name right." Richard looked at Annie then, and there was something like pride on his face, mixed with grief. Victoria drew in a breath. "Richard, we need to speak privately." "No," he said. "For once, this family will not speak about Annie and Maya in rooms where they cannot answer." Annie had come into the house expecting marble floors, old money, maybe even pity. She had not expected to understand her mother more clearly within 5 minutes of meeting Victoria Whitmore. But now she did. Maya had not only left a man, she had escaped a room like this. Victoria did not leave the room right away. She stood near the doorway with one hand on the back of a chair, as if the house itself had taught her she would always have something to hold. Richard looked at her. If you have something to say it in front of them. Victoria gave a small laugh. That is exactly the problem. You are confusing a private family matter with a public confession. Annie felt Sarah's hand brush lightly against her arm, a quiet reminder not to answer too quickly. But the phrase private family matter stayed in Annie's chest like a stone. My mother was private when she was alive, Annie said. People keep making her private now that she's gone. Victoria turned to her with a measured expression. Young lady, you have walked into a situation with legal, financial, and reputational consequences you do not understand. Sarah answered before Annie could. She understands being talked down to. She's had practice. Richard's mouth tightened, but he did not interrupt. He seemed to know this was not a moment he could manage. With a raised hand and a calm voice, Victoria moved farther into the room. Richard, think. A DNA test is not a relationship. It is not history. It is not proof of what Maya wanted. At Maya's name, Annie lifted her eyes. Richard's voice dropped. You don't get to speak for Maya. And you do? Victoria asked. After 18 years? That hit him. Annie saw it. For 1 second, Richard had no answer, and Victoria knew exactly where she had cut him. Sarah stepped in. Nobody here is pretending he did right. Not even him. But you're the only one pretending wrong can still be useful, if it protects the family name. Victoria's face hardened. I won't be lectured in my own family's home. Then don't start by insulting guests, Sarah said. Annie looked at Sarah in surprise. Sarah had always been kind, but kindness in her had never meant softness. She stood there in her blue cardigan, tired from the stairs and the long ride, and somehow seemed more solid than the furniture, the portraits, and the old money pressing in from every wall. Richard turned to Annie. I'm sorry. This is not how I wanted today to go. Annie almost said it was fine, because that was what she had been trained by life to say when people with more power made her uncomfortable. But the words stopped. It's not fine, she said. Richard nodded. No, it isn't. Victoria sighed as if everyone else had become emotional and inconvenient. There are ways to handle this responsibly. Annie asked, What does that mean? Victoria looked at Richard first, not Annie. It means counsel, written agreements, privacy protections, a quiet process before anyone says something that cannot be taken back. Sarah's eyes narrowed. Agreements? Standard protections, Victoria said, for everyone involved. For who? Annie asked. For the family. Annie gave a small nod. Right. Richard's voice sharpened. No one is asking Annie to sign anything today. Victoria's expression barely changed. Not today, perhaps. But eventually. She needs representation. So do we. Annie heard the word representation and thought of fees, offices, papers with paragraphs designed to trap people who could not afford to have them explained twice. She thought of Maya standing outside this same family's reach, carrying a child and dignity no one in this house had cared to protect. I don't want anything from you, Annie said. Victoria looked at her. That is what people often say at the beginning. Sarah moved closer. That's enough. No, Annie said softly. Let her finish. Victoria studied her, perhaps surprised. Annie held her gaze. You think I came here for money? I think money changes how people remember things. My mother remembered enough to keep the bracelet. Victoria's eyes moved to Annie's wrist. A bracelet proves very little. Richard took a step forward. Victoria, but Annie raised her hand slightly. No. Let her say what she thinks. I'd rather hear it to my face. Victoria's voice cooled. Fine. I think this situation is dangerous. I think Richard is grieving and vulnerable. I think a young woman with a difficult life has just been told a very rich man may owe her something, and I think we would be fools not to protect ourselves. Sarah's face went still. Annie felt the sting come, but this time she did not look away. You forgot the part where I returned his leather briefcase without opening it. Victoria glanced at the briefcase. Yes. That was fortunate. No, Annie said. That was honest. For a moment, the room had no answer for that. Richard turned to Victoria with a look Annie had not seen from him before. You will not reduce her to a threat. Victoria's voice lowered. I am trying to save you from being used. Richard looked tired then. but not weak. Maya was pregnant with my child. My child is standing in this room. If you think the first question should be how to protect my money, you have told me everything I need to know. Victoria's mouth parted, then closed. She reached into the slim folder she had carried against her side and removed a card. Then, at least let a family attorney contact her. Nothing binding, just information. Sarah almost laughed. Information from your attorney? Victoria placed the card on the table. She should understand what public recognition may involve. Annie looked at the card but did not touch it. Richard picked it up and tore it once, clean through the center. The sound was quiet, but it cut through the room. Victoria stared at him. No lawyers through you, Richard said. No papers, no offers, no calls. If Annie wants counsel, I will pay for independent counsel of her choice, and you will not know the name unless she chooses to tell you. Annie looked at him, startled. Victoria's face flushed. You are making decisions out of guilt. Yes, Richard said. Some guilt is earned. It may be the first honest thing this family has produced in years. Sarah let out a slow breath. Victoria looked at Annie again, but the cold certainty in her expression had cracked. You have no idea what kind of attention this will bring. Annie's phone buzzed in her purse before she could answer. Then Sarah's buzzed, then Richard's. Denise's name appeared on Annie's screen. Annie answered. Miss Denise? Denise's voice came fast, tight with worry. Honey, are you with Mr. Whitmore? Yes. Some reporter just called the cafe asking if you're the girl from the video. They used your full name. Annie's fingers went numb. What? They asked about your mother too. I didn't say a word, but Annie, somebody gave them more than that little video. Sarah heard enough to reach for Annie's arm. Richard pulled out his phone and checked the screen. His face changed. There's an article. Victoria closed her eyes as if she had expected this and still hated being right. Annie looked at him. What does it say? Richard hesitated. Read it, Annie said. He did not read the whole thing. He only said the headline. Atlanta waitress at center of Whitmore paternity mystery. The words struck Annie harder than Victoria had. Waitress, mystery, as if she were a headline first and a person second, as if Maya were not a mother but a clue, as if Sarah's home, Annie's bracelet, and 18 years of unanswered questions could be folded into gossip for strangers drinking afternoon coffee. Sarah's voice shook with controlled anger. Who gave them her name? Richard looked at Victoria. Victoria's eyes widened. Do not look at me. Then who? He asked. I told no reporter anything. But your people knew? Victoria did not answer fast enough. Annie stepped back. I want to go home. Richard turned to her at once. I'll take you. No, Annie said. Denise can come get us. Sarah nodded. That's best. Richard looked hurt, but he did not argue. All right. Victoria spoke from near the table. This is exactly why this should have been handled privately. Annie turned at the doorway. Her voice was quiet, but it did not shake. No, Miss Whitmore. This is why people like you shouldn't get to decide what privacy means for people like my mother. Then she walked out with Sarah beside her. Richard stayed in the sitting room with the torn attorney's card on the table, his leather briefcase near his feet, and the article spreading through the city faster than any apology could follow. For the first time, Annie was not just facing a father she had never known. She was facing the world that had helped keep him from her. Denise came for Annie and Sarah in the old Ford with a paper bag of biscuits on the passenger seat and anger sitting plain on her face. She did not ask many questions when they got in. She looked once at Annie in the rearview mirror, then at Sarah, and said, I told those reporters nothing. I know, Annie said. I mean it. Not your name. Not Maya's. Not one word. Sarah buckled her seatbelt with slow hands. We believe you. Denise pulled away from the Whitmore gate. Then somebody in that house talks too much. Annie looked out the window as the tall fence moved past. Behind it, Richard's world stayed large and quiet, but outside the gate her phone kept lighting up. Unknown numbers. Messages from people she barely knew. A cousin of a former classmate asking if she was rich now. A woman from the building texting, Girl, is that you on the news? She turned the phone off. Denise noticed. Good. Let the devil leave a voicemail. Sarah gave her a tired look. Denise. What? I'm driving. I'm allowed one sentence. Annie did not smile. Her hands rested in her lap. one thumb moving over the silver bracelet. The leather briefcase had started everything, but now it felt as if the whole city had reached inside her life and begun pulling things out. When they reached the apartment, two neighbors were standing near the front steps pretending to talk about mail. Annie kept her head down. Sarah lifted her chin and walked slowly, but firmly beside her. Inside, the apartment felt like shelter for about 10 seconds. Then Annie saw the blinking light on Sarah's answering machine. Sarah pressed play. A reporter's voice filled the kitchen. "Miss Miller, this is Dana Powell from Channel 6. We're trying to confirm reports that you raised the possible daughter of Richard Whitmore. We'd like to give you a chance to tell your side." Sarah pressed delete. Another message followed. A man this time. "We're prepared to compensate for an exclusive interview." Delete. A third. "There are questions about whether Miss Carter's late mother had a prior relationship with Mr. Whitmore and whether financial arrangements were made." Sarah hit delete so hard the machine shifted. Annie stood by the table, face pale. "They're talking about Mama like that." Sarah turned around. "They don't know your Mama. They don't care." "No," Sarah said. "Most of them care about filling space between commercials." Denise set the biscuit bag on the counter. "I'll stay a while." "You have the cafe," Annie said. "I have staff. And Earl can make himself useful for once by scaring off nosy people. He's been waiting his whole life to be unpleasant for a good cause." A knock came at the door. Everyone froze. Denise moved first. "Stay here." She went to the door and looked through the peephole. Her shoulders lowered, but only a little. "It's an older woman. Says her name is Clara Bennett." Sarah frowned. "Do we know a Clara?" Annie shook her head. Denise opened the door halfway, leaving the chain on. "Can I help you?" A woman's voice answered, thin but clear. "I'm looking for Annie Carter." I knew her mother. Annie's heart moved before her feet did. She stepped closer. "You knew Maya?" The woman outside lifted her face toward the gap. She was older, with gray hair pinned at the back and a brown purse held against her chest. Her coat was neat but dated, and her eyes carried the strain of someone who had debated turning around many times before knocking. "Yes," she said. "I worked in the Whitmore house when your mother was still coming there." Sarah came to Annie's side. "Why are you here?" Clara looked at Sarah, then back at Annie. "Because I saw the news, and because if I wait any longer, I may die with a truth that should have been spoken years ago." Denise shut the door, unlatched the chain, and opened it again. "Come in then. But understand something. If you came to hurt this girl, you picked the wrong kitchen." Clara nodded. "I believe that." She stepped inside and looked around the small apartment with a softness that made Annie uneasy. Not pity. Exactly. Recognition. As if Clara had seen women build homes out of not enough before, Sarah pointed to a chair. "Sit down." Clara sat carefully, both hands still around her purse. Denise remained near the counter. Annie stayed standing. Clara looked at her wrist. "She kept the bracelet on you." Annie's breath caught. "You knew about it?" "I saw it once." Maya came to the back entrance of the Whitmore house with it wrapped in blue cloth. She was angry that day. Not loud. Maya was not loud when she was truly hurt. She got very still. Sarah pulled out a chair and sat. "What happened?" Clara swallowed. She wanted to see Richard. His father would not allow it. Annie's voice was barely steady. "Was she pregnant?" "Yes." The answer landed with less surprise than pain. Clara opened her purse and took out a folded envelope, yellowed with age. "Before I say more, I should tell you I was not brave. I worked for that family. I had rent, a sick husband, and no savings. That does not excuse me. It only tells you what kind of fear I chose." Sarah's expression did not soften. "What did you choose?" Clara looked down. Silence. Denise muttered, "That's a crowded club." Clara accepted it. Maya came more than once. The first time, Mr. Whitmore's father sent her away. The second time, she brought a letter. She asked me if I could see that Richard got it. Annie reached for the back of a chair. "Did you?" Clara's eyes filled. "No. I gave it to the house manager. That was the rule." Sarah closed her eyes. "I regretted it before the day was over," Clara said. Maya knew I was scared. She pressed another copy into my hand outside by the service gate. She said, "If they bury one, maybe God will trouble you about the other." Annie whispered. "She said that?" Clara nodded. "I kept it. I never delivered it." Denise leaned forward. "Then why bring it now?" "Because I have had 18 years of God troubling me." No one spoke for a moment. Clara pushed the envelope across the table, but not all the way to Annie. "It is a copy. Her handwriting. Her words. I have read it more times than I can defend." Annie did not touch it. "What does it say?" Clara took off her glasses, wiped them with a cloth, then put them back on, though her hands shook. "It says she had given birth to a daughter. It says the baby was named Annie Carter. It says she did not want money. It says Richard deserved to know his daughter was born, even if he did not deserve to be forgiven." Sarah covered her mouth with one hand. Annie felt tears rise, but they did not fall. "She told him?" "She tried." "Did he ever see it?" "I don't believe so." "Why?" Clara looked toward the window, though there was nothing to see but the side of the next building. "Because every letter that came for Richard from Maya was sent first to his father's office or the family attorney. I saw at least 3, maybe more." Denise said. "That woman at the house, Victoria, did she know?" Clara hesitated. Sarah's voice cut in. "Don't start protecting them now." Clara nodded slowly. "Victoria was young, but old enough to understand. She saw Maya at the door once. She told her Richard was engaged to the life he was supposed to have." Annie flinched. "That was not true at the time," Clara said quickly. "Not yet." But Maya heard it. Annie pulled out the chair and sat down because her legs would not hold. She looked at the envelope, at the careful handwriting on the front. Not Richard's name. No address now. Just an old paper carrying the weight of a woman who had tried. "I thought she hid me from him," Annie said. Sarah reached for her hand. "Maybe she hid you after they made sure he didn't come." Clara wiped her eyes. "I am sorry. That is not enough. But I am." Annie looked at her. "Why didn't you come sooner?" The question was not cruel. That made it worse. Clara's shoulders bent. "Because shame becomes a habit if you keep it long enough. And because people like the Whitmores teach workers to think truth is above their station." Denise crossed her arms. "Truth doesn't have a station." "No," Clara said. "I know that now." Annie finally touched the envelope. Her fingers rested on Maya's handwriting. "Can I keep this?" "It is yours," Clara said. Then she corrected herself, almost painfully. "It should have reached your family years ago." Annie pulled the envelope close, but did not open it yet. Reading her mother's words would take more courage than she had in front of witnesses. Her phone, still turned off, lay dark on the table. Outside, someone passed in the hallway. Footsteps slowing near the door before moving on. Sarah looked at Denise. "We need Richard to see this." Annie's first instinct was to say no. Richard had already entered too much of her life too fast. But this letter was not about comfort. It was about Maya. It was about the years Annie had believed silence meant absence. She turned to Clara. "Will you tell him what you told us?" Clara's eyes filled again. "Yes." "And Victoria?" Clara's mouth tightened. "If I must." Annie looked down at the envelope. For the first time since the article appeared, the shame was not hers. It had shape now. It had names. It had rooms and gates and people who chose convenience over a woman standing outside with a baby's name written in her hand. Sarah squeezed Annie's fingers. "Baby?" Annie took a breath. "Call him," she said. "But not from his house. He can come here." Sarah called Richard from the kitchen table while Annie sat with Maya's unopened letter in both hands. The paper was thin, softened at the folds, and Annie was afraid of it in a way that made no sense. She had faced customers who looked past her, bills that arrived before paychecks, and long nights when Sarah's breathing scared her. But this letter was different. It had waited 18 years to speak in her mother's voice. Richard answered before the second ring. "Sarah? It's me," Sarah said. "You need to come to the apartment." A pause. "Is Annie all right?" Annie looked down. Sarah's voice stayed steady. "She's here. Clara Bennett is here too." The name changed the silence on the line. Richard spoke more carefully. "Clara Bennett from my parents' house?" "Yes." "Is Victoria there?" "No." "And don't bring her." And don't. I won't. No lawyer, no assistant, no driver standing at the door like we're expecting a raid. I'll come alone. Sarah looked at Annie. Annie nodded once. And Richard, Sarah added, if reporters follow you here, keep driving. I understand. He arrived 40 minutes later in a plain, dark sedan, not the larger car with the driver. Denise watched from the window until he crossed the street alone. She opened the door before he could knock. You came by yourself, she said. Yes, ma'am. Good. Come in. Richard stepped into the apartment and removed his coat without being asked. He looked too large for the narrow entry, too careful among the thrift store lamp, the shoes near the door, the small framed print above the radiator. His eyes found Annie at the table, then Clara seated near the window, her purse held in her lap. Clara, he said. Clara stood with effort. Mr. Richard. He flinched at the old household name. Please don't call me that. Her mouth trembled. Habit. Sarah pointed to the empty chair. Sit. Richard sat. Nobody offered coffee. Nobody made small talk. The apartment did not have room for it. Annie placed the envelope on the table between them. She wrote to you. Richard looked at the envelope as if it were not paper but a living thing. Maya? Clara answered. Yes. She gave me that copy at the service gate. She had already sent one through the house. Richard did not touch it. I never saw it. I know, Clara said. I should have made sure you did. Sarah's voice was firm but not cruel. Then tell him. Clara folded her hands, looking older with each breath. Maya came to the house after she left you. She was carrying Annie then. Your father would not let her through the front door. The house manager brought her around to the side like she was delivering laundry. Richard closed his eyes. Annie watched him and felt no need to comfort him. That pain was his to hold. Clara continued. She asked for you. Your father said you were unavailable. That was not true. You were upstairs with Victoria and the attorney. I remember because I carried coffee to the study. Richard opened his eyes. I was there? Yes. His voice broke. She was downstairs? At the side entrance. The words changed the room. Annie felt Sarah's hand find hers under the table. Clara reached into her purse and took out a smaller note, copied in her own handwriting years later. The first letter went to your father's office. The second went through Mr. Harlan, the family attorney. The third I saw on Victoria's desk. Richard looked up sharply. Victoria? Clara nodded. She told the staff not to mention Maya's visits. She said the family was handling it. Sarah gave a bitter little breath. Handling. There's that word again. Richard looked sick. Did Maya know I was there? Clara's eyes filled. I don't know. But Victoria told her you were moving on. She told her you had chosen the life expected of you. Annie's fingers tightened around Sarah's. Richard whispered, I never said that. No, Clara said. But by then, Maya had heard enough from people speaking in your name. That sentence landed harder than a shout. Richard bent forward, elbows on his knees, one hand over his mouth. When he spoke, his voice was low. I thought she vanished. I thought she decided I was not worth finding. Annie looked at him. Maybe she thought the same about you. He nodded, tears in his eyes. She had reason. Sarah slid the envelope closer to Annie. Do you want to read it, or do you want me to? Annie looked at Maya's handwriting. She wanted her mother's voice more than anything. She was also afraid that once she heard it, she would lose whatever small wall had kept her standing. I'll read it, she said. Her hands shook when she opened the envelope. Inside was one folded sheet. The ink had faded, but the words were clear. Richard, I am writing this because anger should not be the only thing our daughter inherits from me. Her name is Annie Carter. She was born on June 14. She has your eyes when she is quiet and my mouth when she is hungry, which means the Lord has a sense of humor. Annie stopped. A sound escaped Sarah, half laugh, half sob. Richard pressed his hand to his eyes. Annie forced herself to continue. I do not want your money. I do not want your family deciding what kind of woman I am after refusing to see me as one. But you should know she is here. You should know she is real. You should know I kept the bracelet because a gift to a child should not have to carry the sins of grown people. Annie's voice faltered. Denise stood near the counter, wiping her eyes with a napkin she pretended to need for something else. If you come as her father. not as a Whitmore trying to correct a mistake quietly. If you do not come, I will raise her without teaching her to hate you. That is the last kindness I can give either of you. Annie lowered the page. She could not read the final lines aloud. Sarah leaned closer and finished softly. I loved you once. I will not let that love become a place where my daughter learns to kneel. Maya. The apartment went still. Richard's face had changed completely. It was not the shock from the cafe, nor the guilt from the clinic. This was something deeper. A man realizing that the woman he had mourned had not simply disappeared. She had stood at the door with truth in her hand, and his family had turned her away. I need to go to her, he said. Annie looked at him. Where? Richard answered without looking up. Her grave. If you'll allow me. Sarah watched Annie. Clara looked down at her hands. Denise stayed quiet. Annie folded the letter carefully and placed it back on the table. You don't need my permission to visit a grave. Richard looked at her then. But you need to understand something, Annie said. You don't get to stand there and make yourself the saddest person in the story. He took that in. I know. No. I need you to really know it. My mother isn't here to hear you. She doesn't get those years back. She doesn't get to know you finally read the letter. Richard's voice was barely steady. I know. Annie looked at the paper again. Justice is not always fair. Sometimes it arrives late, carrying flowers to a grave instead of answers to the living. No one spoke after that. Sarah stood slowly. Then we go together. Not for him. For Maya. Clara rose too. I should come. Annie looked at her. Yes, you should. Denise reached for her keys. I'll drive whoever fits. Richard stood but did not reach for his coat yet. Annie. I am sorry. She looked at him, tired beyond anger. Tell her first. An hour later, they stood at Maya Carter's grave beneath a gray Atlanta sky. The cemetery was quiet except for traffic beyond the fence, and the dry whisper of leaves moving along the ground. Richard held no expensive arrangement, only a small bundle of white flowers Sarah had chosen from a grocery store on the way because Maya had liked simple things. He stood before the headstone and could not speak at first. Annie did not help him. Finally, Richard bent his head. Maya, he said, and her name broke in his mouth. I read your letter. The wind moved through the grass. I should have come to the door. I should have gone against them. I should have been a man before I became a Whitmore. Annie held Sarah's hand. Richard placed the flowers at the grave. You gave our daughter my name before I earned the right to hear her voice. I am sorry. I am sorry for every year my silence made yours heavier. Annie looked at the stone, at her mother's name, at the dates carved beneath it. The truth had arrived, but Maya remained where she was. That was the cruelty of it. That was why late justice could still hurt. When they left the cemetery, Richard did not ask Annie for forgiveness. He only walked a few steps behind her, carrying nothing now but the knowledge that some doors do not open just because regret finally knocks. By the time they returned from the cemetery, the sky had begun to clear, but Annie felt no lighter. Denise dropped Clara off first. The older woman stepped out slowly, one hand on the car door, the other holding her purse close. Before she shut the door, she looked at Annie. I'll say it again if I have to, Clara said. In front of Victoria. In front of anyone. Annie nodded. Thank you. Clara's mouth trembled. I should have said it when your mother could hear it. Sarah, sitting beside Annie, answered softly. Then say it right now. And don't stop. Clara nodded, shut the door, and walked toward her small porch. Denise waited until she was inside before driving on. Richard followed in his own car. Annie could see him through the rear window at red lights, one car behind, hands on the wheel, face forward. He had offered to drive them, but Sarah had said no before Annie could answer. Not cruelly, just clearly. At the apartment, reporters were waiting. Only two at first, a man with a camera and a woman holding a microphone near the curb. Then another car slowed. Someone lifted a phone from across the street. Denise cursed under her breath. I knew it. Sarah's hand tightened around Annie's. Keep walking. Don't answer. The woman with the microphone stepped closer. Annie Carter? Is it true Richard Whitmore confirmed paternity? Did your mother keep this secret for financial reasons? Annie stopped. Sarah whispered, "Baby, don't." The reporter pressed on. "Miss Miller, did you receive money from the Whitmore family for raising Annie?" Richard's car pulled in behind Denise's. The driver's door opened hard, and Richard got out before anyone could move toward Annie again. "That's enough," he said. The camera turned to him. "Mr. Whitmore, can you confirm?" "No," Richard said. His voice was low, but it cut clean. "You will not stand outside this woman's home and insult the dead or harass her family." The reporter did not lower the microphone. "The public has questions." "The public can wait." Annie looked at him then. She did not want to be grateful. Gratitude made things complicated. But the reporter had spoken about Maya as if she were a scandal, and Richard had stepped between that sentence and the next one. Sarah pulled Annie toward the building. Denise followed, one arm out as if she could block the whole sidewalk with her body. Inside the apartment, Annie went straight to the kitchen table and sat down. Her hands shook. Sarah locked the door, then checked it twice. Richard knocked a minute later. Sarah opened the door but did not step aside right away. "No reporters followed you up?" "No." "You sure?" "I waited until they moved back." Sarah studied him, then let him in. Richard entered without his coat. He looked less like a man from headlines now, and more like someone who had run out of easy rooms. "I'm sorry," he said. Annie looked up. "You keep saying that." "I know. It doesn't stop them." "No, it doesn't." Denise stood near the sink, arms crossed. "Then what does?" Richard looked at her, then at Sarah, then at Annie. "Action." Sarah gave a short nod. "That's a better word." Richard sat only after Annie pointed to a chair. He did not come too close. He seemed to understand the apartment had its own rules. "My sister is calling an emergency family meeting tomorrow morning," he said. "She thinks this can still be managed privately." Annie gave a quiet, bitter laugh. "Managed? I know. Do you?" Annie asked. "Because your family has a lot of words for making people disappear without saying disappear." Richard did not flinch this time. "Yes. And I let those words pass as wisdom once. I will not do it again." Sarah sat beside Annie. "What does Victoria want?" "She wants lawyers. A prepared statement. A private settlement. She wants Annie to sign documents before I make anything public." Denise made a sound from the sink. "Of course she does." Annie's face went cold. "Documents saying what?" Richard's jaw tightened. "That she will not use the Whitmore name publicly, speak to media, make claims against the estate, or discuss Maya's relationship with me." Sarah's chair scraped the floor as she shifted. "And what would Annie get for selling her own story back to your family?" "A large payment," Richard said. Annie looked at him. "I told her no," he added quickly. "Before you ask, I told her no." Annie's voice stayed quiet. Was she going to offer that to me, or to Sarah? Richard's silence was answer enough. Sarah's face hardened. "She thought I could be bought. She said you had medical bills," Richard said, the shame clear in his voice. "She said people in difficult circumstances often welcome practical solutions." Denise stepped away from the sink. "That woman better be glad I don't drive back there tonight." Sarah looked at Richard. "And you?" "I told her Sarah Miller raised my daughter when I failed to find her, and that if Victoria ever spoke of her like a transaction again, she would not be welcome in my house." Annie heard the word daughter and felt her chest tighten. It still sounded too new, too heavy, too wanted and unwanted at the same time. Sarah looked at Annie. "Baby?" Annie did not answer her. She looked at Richard. "Tomorrow, when they say I'm after money, what are you going to say?" "The truth. That's not enough. People say that when they want credit for being vague." Richard nodded. "Then I'll be plain. I will say you returned my leather briefcase without opening it. I will say I asked unfair questions, and you still acted with more dignity than I did. I will say the DNA test confirms you are my daughter. I will say Maya wrote to me and my family kept that letter from me. I will say Sarah raised you with love and deserves respect, not suspicion." Annie's eyes began to burn, but she held herself steady. "And will you say you were wrong?" "Yes. Not your father, not Victoria. You." Richard's voice lowered. "Yes. I was wrong. I asked Maya to wait while I tried to make cowards comfortable. She left because I made her carry courage, alone." The room went quiet. Sarah turned her face away for a moment. Denise wiped the counter, though there was nothing on it. Annie looked at Maya's photograph near the sugar jar. "They're going to hate me," Richard answered. "Some will." She looked back at him, surprised by the honesty. He continued, "Some people hate any truth that costs them comfort. I can't keep every cruel word from reaching you, but I can make sure no one in my family gets to hide behind mine." Annie touched the bracelet. "I don't want to go back to that house." "You don't have to, but I don't want them talking about me if I'm not there." Sarah's hand covered hers. "You sure?" "No," Annie said. "But I'm tired of rooms where people say my mother's name like she isn't allowed inside." Richard looked at her with pain and pride mixed together. "Then you should be there. Only if you choose." Denise said, "I'm coming." Sarah nodded. "So am I." Richard looked at them both. "Victoria will object." Denise gave him a flat look. "Victoria can take a number." For the first time that day, Annie almost smiled. Richard reached into his jacket pocket and removed a folded paper. "This is the address and time. 10 tomorrow. I'll arrange for you to enter through the front door. Not the side. Not a service entrance. The front." Sarah's eyes sharpened at that detail. Annie took the paper. "Did Maya have to use the side?" Richard's answer came with visible effort. "Yes." Annie folded the paper once and set it beside Maya's photograph. "Then tomorrow, we use the front." Richard stood after a moment. "I should let you rest." Annie wanted to ask him to stay. She wanted him gone. Both feelings lived too close together to separate. At the door, he turned back. "Annie." She looked at him. "I know tomorrow won't repair anything." "No," she said. "It won't. But it may stop the next lie." That stayed with her after he left. Later, when Denise had gone and Sarah was asleep in the chair, Annie sat alone at the kitchen table with the bracelet on her wrist. Maya's letter opened beside her, and the address of the Whitmore house folded under her hand. Tomorrow would not bring her mother back. It would not erase the years, but for once, the people who had spoken over Maya Carter would have to say her name with Annie in the room. At 10 the next morning, Annie Carter walked through the front door of the Whitmore house with Sarah on one side and Denise Bell on the other. Richard was waiting in the entry hall. He wore a dark suit, but his tie was loose, and there were shadows under his eyes that no money could hide. When he saw Annie, his gaze dropped first to the silver bracelet on her wrist, then to the folded letter in her hand. "You came," he said. Annie looked past him, toward the long hall and the rooms where Maya had once been turned away. "You said we'd use the front." Richard nodded. "And you will." Sarah gave him a brief look. "Good start." Denise leaned closer to Annie and murmured, "You just breathe." Rich people hate it when regular folks breathe in their expensive rooms. Annie almost smiled, but her stomach was too tight. She had slept badly, waking before sunrise with Maya's letter under her pillow and the article still moving across the internet. She had wanted to stay home. She had wanted to let Richard fight his family alone. But then she had read the last line of Maya's letter again. "I will not let that love become a place where my daughter learns to kneel." So Annie had dressed simply, put on the bracelet, placed her mother's photograph in her wallet, and come. Richard led them into a large room at the back of the house. A long table stood in the center. Victoria sat at one end with two older relatives, a financial advisor, and a woman Annie assumed was connected to the family office. No one rose except one gray-haired man who seemed unsure whether manners still applied. Victoria looked at Annie's group, then at Richard. "This is unnecessary." Richard pulled out a chair for Annie but did not touch her. "No, this is overdue." Annie sat. Sarah took the chair beside her. Denise remained standing near the wall, until Richard said, "Miss Bell, please sit wherever you like." Denise chose the chair closest to Annie. "I like here." Victoria folded her hands. "Before this becomes emotional, let me be clear. No one here is denying the laboratory result, but the result creates responsibilities, and responsibilities require structure." Sarah said, "That sounds like papers." "It sounds like order," Victoria replied. Annie placed Maya's folded letter on the table. "My mother tried order. She wrote a letter." Victoria's eyes moved to the paper. "So, I've been told." Richard took a seat across from Annie, not at the head of the table. That seemed to bother Victoria more than anything he had said. The financial advisor cleared his throat. Mr. Whitmore, the concern is not the young woman personally. The concern is exposure. Public recognition can open questions around inheritance, media access, and reputational instability. Denise looked at him. You practice saying that in a mirror? The man blinked. Excuse me? She's a person. Try it that way. Victoria's voice cooled. Miss Bell, this is a family matter. Denise leaned back. Then maybe act like a family. Richard raised one hand, not to silence Denise, but to begin. Enough. I asked everyone here because I want there to be no misunderstanding after today. Victoria turned to him. Richard, I strongly advise. No, he said. You have advised enough. The room changed. Annie saw it in the faces around the table. They were used to Richard being controlled. They were not used to him sounding final. He placed a folder on the table. The DNA result confirms Annie Carter is my daughter. I will recognize her legally and publicly. I will not ask her to change her name. I will not ask her to sign away her voice. I will not permit anyone connected to this family to approach Sarah Miller with money in exchange for silence. The older woman near Victoria lifted her chin. No one used the word silence. Sarah looked at her. You didn't have to, Richard continued. Maya Carter wrote to me after Annie was born. That letter did not reach me. Clara Bennett has given a statement about Maya's visits to this house, the handling of her letters, and the way my family kept her from me. Victoria's face tightened. A former employee with a guilty conscience is not a reliable historian. Annie opened Maya's letter and laid it flat. Her hands shook, but her voice did not. This is my mother's handwriting. Victoria looked away. That proves she wrote something. It proves she tried, Annie said. Richard looked at his sister. And it proves we did not. Victoria pushed back from the table. We were protecting you. Richard's mouth hardened. No, you were protecting the version of me that made this family comfortable. You were grieving, confused, under pressure. I was a grown man, Richard said. Do not make me smaller to make our choices look kinder. Annie looked at him then. For the first time, she did not see only the man who had failed Maya. She saw a man refusing to hide behind the excuse his family had kept polished for him. Victoria stood. You are going to destroy this family over a girl you met in a coffee shop. Richard stood too, slowly. No, this family was damaged the day we decided a black woman carrying my child was something to hide. The words settled over the table like a door closing. No one spoke. Annie felt Sarah's hand find hers under the table. Denise stopped shifting in her chair. Even the advisor lowered his eyes to his papers. Victoria's face drained of color. That is a cruel thing to say. It is a true thing to say, Richard answered. Maya came to this house, and she was sent to a side entrance. She wrote letters, and they were intercepted. She gave birth to my daughter, and people in this family decided I did not need to know because knowing would have cost us comfort. Victoria's voice lowered. Father made those decisions, and I benefited from them, Richard said. So did you. Annie's eyes burned. She looked at Maya's letter, at the line about not teaching her daughter to kneel. Richard turned toward her then, and when he spoke again, his voice changed. It was no longer meant for Victoria. Maya left because I asked her to wait while I negotiated her dignity with people who never believed she had any. Annie's breath caught. Richard looked at Sarah, and while I failed, you did not. You raised my daughter. You sat in the rooms I should have entered. You kept her fed, safe, loved, and honest. No one at this table will speak of you as an opportunity, a burden, or a transaction again. Sarah's lips pressed together, but tears gathered in her eyes. Victoria sat down slowly. Richard, you are making promises with consequences. Yes, he said. For once. The advisor tried again, softer. There should still be legal process. There will be, Richard said. Independent counsel for Annie, chosen by Annie, paid for by me, with no reporting back to this family. Counsel for Sarah as well, if she wants it. Every document will be explained in plain language. No pressure, no deadlines designed to frighten anyone. Annie looked up. And my mother? Richard nodded. Her name will be corrected in every statement, not hidden, not softened, not reduced to an unfortunate relationship. Victoria said, You cannot control how the press frames this. No, Richard said. But I can control whether my own family feeds them shame. The room fell quiet again. Annie reached into her wallet and took out the old photograph of Maya. She placed it beside the letter. Then, after a moment, Richard opened his leather briefcase and took out his photograph, the one that had fallen in the cafe. He placed it beside Annie's. 2 pictures. The same woman. 2 lives split apart by people who thought money gave them permission to decide which truths deserved daylight. Annie looked at Victoria. "You said, I walked into a situation I didn't understand. Maybe that's true. I didn't understand how a house this big could be so afraid of one woman with a letter." Victoria's face changed, but she had no answer. Richard moved to stand beside Annie's chair. He did not put a hand on her shoulder. He did not claim more closeness than she had given him. He simply stood near enough to make his choice plain. "This is my daughter," he said. "Her name is Annie Carter. She does not need my money to become someone. She already is someone. But she will have my name, my protection, and my apology for every year I was not there." Annie's tears came then, quiet and unwanted. She wiped them quickly, but Sarah held her hand tighter. Richard turned back to the table. "If anyone here cannot accept that, you may leave this family office, this house, and any position funded by my name." The older man at the table cleared his throat. "Richard, I think perhaps we should listen." Victoria looked at him sharply. He did not look back. One by one, the room shifted, not warmly, not fully. But the certainty that Annie could be dismissed had broken. Denise leaned toward Annie and whispered, "Your mama would have liked that part." Annie looked down at Maya's photograph. She did not know if that was true, but she hoped it was. Victoria gathered her folder, her hands stiff. At the door, she stopped. "This will not end cleanly," Richard answered. "It already began badly. Clean was never the point." Victoria left without another word. For a long moment after the door closed, no one moved. Then Sarah stood, walked around the table, and faced Richard. "You hurt Maya," she said. "I know. You hurt Annie before you ever met her." His eyes filled. "I know." Sarah looked at him for several seconds. "Then spend the rest of your life knowing it while doing better." Richard nodded. "I will." Annie stood too. She picked up Maya's letter and both photographs, holding them carefully against her chest. She was not healed. She was not ready to call him anything. But the room that had once shut Maya out had heard her name. And this time, no one had been able to send her away. The first statement Richard released was only 7 sentences long. He wrote it himself at Annie's kitchen table 2 days after the family meeting. While Sarah read every line with her glasses low on her nose and Denise stood by the stove making coffee strong enough to make the room sit up straight, Annie sat across from him with Maya's letter folded beside her hand. Richard had arrived that morning without the leather briefcase. Annie noticed and did not ask about it. Maybe he understood that the briefcase had already done its part. He placed a yellow legal pad on the table and said, "I don't want a public relations team writing about your mother." Sarah gave a short nod. "Good. They'd turn her into a paragraph." Annie looked at him. "What are you going to say?" "The truth," Richard said. Then he caught himself. "Plainly," he wrote slowly. Crossed out more than he kept. Once, he wrote the phrase "private matter," then stopped, drew a line through it, and looked at Annie. "You caught it," she said. "I did." Sarah pointed at the page. "Try family truth. That's closer." Richard wrote that down. The final statement said Annie Carter was his daughter. It said Maya Carter was Annie's mother and a woman he had loved. It said he had failed Maya when she deserved courage. It said Sarah Miller had raised Annie with devotion and would be treated with gratitude and respect. It asked the press not to harass Annie, Sarah, their neighbors, or the staff at Bell and Finch Coffee. It did not call Maya a regret. It did not call Annie a surprise. It did not mention money. Annie read it twice. "It's not enough," she said. Richard nodded. "I know, but it doesn't lie." "No." "Then send it." The statement did not stop the noise, but it changed its direction. Some reporters moved on when they realized Richard would not feed them drama. Others dug harder. But Denise became a wall at the cafe door. And Earl, who had appointed himself unpaid doorman, sat at the counter every morning with his newspaper and a look that discouraged questions. When one young reporter came in asking whether Annie still worked there, Earl lowered his paper and said, "She works harder than you do. Buy coffee or find the exit." Denise later told Annie, "I didn't even have to threaten him. He did that free." Annie did not return to regular shifts right away. She came in for a few hours after closing to help Denise restock, wipe counters, and feel normal without being watched. The first night back, she stood behind the counter longer than necessary, touching the worn edge of the register. Denise saw her. "You all right?" "No." "Fair. I miss when this place was just coffee." Denise leaned on the counter beside her. "Nothing is ever just coffee. People come here carrying bills, grief, doctor news, bad marriages, good gossip, and sometimes leather briefcases they should have kept track of." Annie gave a small laugh. "There she is," Denise said. The legal process began the following week. Richard kept his word. He hired an independent attorney for Annie and Sarah, a black woman named Marjorie Ellis, who had practiced family and estate law in Atlanta for 30 years and did not seem impressed by Richard's money. At their first meeting, Marjorie looked at Richard over the top of her reading glasses and said, "You understand I represent them, not your conscience." Richard answered, "Yes, ma'am." Marjorie turned to Annie. "Good, he learns." Annie liked her immediately. The paperwork was not simple, but Marjorie made it plain. Richard could legally acknowledge Annie as his daughter. Annie did not have to change her last name. She did not have to move. She did not have to accept any arrangement she did not understand. She did not have to smile for cameras, attend events, or become proof that the Whitmore family had grown a heart overnight. Sarah asked the question Annie had been afraid to ask. "What about money?" Marjorie folded her hands. "There are support options, education trusts, estate considerations, medical coverage, housing assistance. We discuss them one at a time, and nobody signs anything because they feel cornered." Richard, sitting at the far end of the conference table, said nothing unless asked. Annie looked at him once. "You're quiet." "I was told to be." Marjorie nodded, and for once, a man listened. Sarah covered a smile with her hand. The hardest part came when Richard offered to help Sarah move out of the apartment. He did not bring it up in a conference room. He waited until he was invited for dinner, which Sarah called supper no matter what time it was. They ate chicken stew, cornbread, and green beans at the old kitchen table while rain tapped the window. After the dishes were cleared, Richard said, "Sarah, I would like to help with housing. Only if you want that. Only in your name. No conditions." Sarah looked at him for a long time. "I don't want charity." "I know. Do you?" "Yes," he said. "This is gratitude. It will still feel like money because it is money, and I won't pretend that part is simple. But I am not buying forgiveness from Annie, and I am not buying motherhood from you. You raised her. I cannot repay that. I can only stop pretending thanks should be spoken instead of acted on." Sarah's eyes grew wet, but her voice stayed firm. "If I say yes, it's because my knees hate those stairs and Annie needs a room where the window sees something besides brick." Richard nodded. "That is reason enough." Annie looked down at her plate. She did not want to feel relief, but she did. The apartment had been home, but it had also been damp winters, thin walls, and Sarah resting halfway up the stairs when her breath failed. They found a small house 3 weeks later, not far from Annie's school and close enough to Bell and Finch that Denise said she could still meddle without wasting gas. It had a front porch, 2 bedrooms, a bright kitchen, and a patch of yard, where Sarah said she might plant tomatoes if the Georgia heat did not kill her first. Richard offered bigger. Sarah refused. "I said a house," she told him, "not a museum." Annie chose the room facing the street. The first thing she placed on the dresser was Maya's photograph. Beside it, she laid the copy of Maya's letter, folded in a clear sleeve Marjorie had given her. On moving day, Richard came in jeans and a work shirt. Denise laughed so hard she had to sit down. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, "that hammer still got a price tag on it?" Richard looked at the tool in his hand. "Possibly. Earl helped carry boxes and complained the whole time, which everyone understood was his way of being useful without admitting he cared. At one point, he handed Annie a box-marked kitchen and said, 'Don't let rich folks pack plates. They wrap one cup like it's the Liberty Bell.'" Richard heard him and said, "That may be fair." Annie smiled more that day than she expected. The Maya Carter Scholarship began as Annie's idea and became the first thing that felt like something beyond pain. She told Richard she did not want a statue, a gala, or a speech about inspiration. I want money going to girls who need it before they have to give up, she said. Community college, trade programs, nursing, engineering, whatever gets them forward. Richard wrote it down. No essays about overcoming hardship, Annie added. He looked up. No essays? They already lived it. Don't make them perform it. Sarah said, Amen. The first fund documents used Maya Carter's full name. Not initials. Not a foundation-friendly version. Maya Carter, a woman who had written a letter, kept a bracelet, and refused to raise her daughter on hate. Weeks passed. The story faded from headlines, as all stories do when strangers find new things to argue about. But in Annie's life, the changes stayed. The new house smelled of fresh paint and cardboard. Sarah slept better without stairs. Annie registered for classes with Richard's education trust available but not pushed on her. She still kept her cafe apron folded in a drawer and worked short shifts on Saturdays because she liked the regulars and because Bell and Finch had been there before the world knew her name. One Saturday, Richard came in for coffee. No assistant. No announcement. Just a man at the counter, holding his wallet like he was still learning how to be ordinary in this room. Denise called out, "Black coffee? No sugar?" Richard smiled faintly. "Yes, ma'am." Annie poured it. For a moment, both of them remembered the first morning, the leather briefcase, the accusation, the photograph on the floor. Richard took the cup. "Thank you, Annie." She nodded. "You're welcome." He hesitated. "May I come by tomorrow?" Sarah said she was making breakfast. Annie looked at him over the counter. "She invited you?" "She said I could come if you agreed." "That sounds like her." Richard waited. Annie touched the silver bracelet on her wrist. Some days it still felt like a question, some days like an answer, most days like both. "Come at 9, she said. Richard's face softened, but he kept his voice calm. "I'll be there. And don't bring anything expensive." "I won't. Biscuits are fine." He almost laughed. "Biscuits I can do." Annie watched him take his coffee to the small table by the window, the same table where he had once left the leather briefcase. This time, when he stood to leave, he checked the chair beside him before walking out. Denise saw it and leaned close to Annie. "Man's learning." Annie looked at the empty chair, then at Richard stepping into the Atlanta sun. "Yes," she said, slowly. Sunday morning came with pale Atlanta sunlight, the smell of coffee, and Sarah Miller standing at the stove in her robe, arguing with a pan of eggs like it had personally offended her. "They stick because you turn the heat too high," Annie said from the counter. Sarah gave her a look over one shoulder. "I have been making eggs longer than you have been alive. And they've been sticking that whole time?" Sarah pointed the spatula at her. "Keep talking and you can eat toast." Annie smiled and set 3 plates on the small kitchen table. The house still felt new in places. The porch boards did not creak the way the old apartment stairs had. The kitchen window faced a narrow strip of yard where Sarah had already set 2 tomato plants in red clay pots. A box of unpacked books sat near the wall, and Maya's photograph rested on the sideboard beside a vase of grocery store flowers Richard had not brought. Annie had bought them herself the day before, yellow ones because Sarah said the room needed cheer. Annie wore jeans and a soft gray sweater, her silver bracelet resting against her wrist. She had polished it that morning with a cloth Sarah used for old spoons. The engraving looked clearer now. Annie Carter, June 14. At 8:57, a car door closed outside. Sarah looked at the clock. 3 minutes early. Nervous, Annie picked up 2 mugs from the counter. "How do you know?" People with money arrive exactly on time when they're confident, early when they're scared. A knock came at the front door. Annie stood still for a second, 1 mug in each hand. Sarah's voice softened. "You want me to get it?" "No." Annie set the mugs down. "I will." She walked through the short hall, past the living room with its second-hand couch, folded quilt, and framed print Denise had given them as a housewarming gift. At the door, she drew one steady breath, then opened it. Richard Whitmore stood on the porch holding a white paper bag from Bell and Finch Coffee. No suit today. Dark pants, plain shirt, jacket folded over one arm. His hair had been combed but not carefully enough to hide the fact that he had probably touched it too many times on the drive over. "I brought biscuits," he said. Annie looked at the bag. "From Denise? She said if I showed up with store-bought, I shouldn't show up at all." "That sounds like her." Richard glanced past her, not stepping in until invited. "Good morning." "Morning." There was a pause. Not painful exactly, but full. Annie moved aside. "You can come in." Richard stepped over the threshold as if it mattered where his feet landed. Maybe it did. The last time he had entered Annie's life, it had been through a lost leather briefcase. Questions and grief. This time he came with biscuits and no audience. Sarah called from the kitchen. "If that's Richard, tell him breakfast is getting cold." Richard's eyes lifted toward the sound. "Yes, ma'am." Annie almost laughed. "She heard you." "I assumed she would." He followed her into the kitchen. Sarah turned from the stove and looked him over. "No briefcase?" she asked. "No, Mom." "Good. Sit down before you offer to buy something." Richard accepted that with the closest thing to a smile Annie had seen from him that morning. "I'll try." Sarah took the biscuit bag from him and opened it. "At least you can follow instructions." They sat at the table. Sarah near the stove. Annie by the window. Richard across from her. For a minute, breakfast gave them something to do. Eggs, biscuits, bacon, coffee with cream for Sarah, black for Richard, a little sugar for Annie, though she pretended not to like it sweet. Richard looked around the kitchen, not with judgment, but with attention. The curtains Sarah had picked. The chipped blue bowl holding oranges. Maya's photograph on the sideboard. His eyes stopped there, then returned to his plate. Sarah noticed. "You can look at it. We don't hide her here." Richard set down his fork. "Thank you." Annie followed his gaze. In the photograph, Maya was still young, one hand near her hair, caught between smiling and speaking. Annie wondered what her mother would think of this table. Sarah in her robe, Richard trying not to seem too rich, Annie sitting between what raised her and what had found her late. After breakfast, Sarah stood to clear plates. Richard rose at once. "I can help." Sarah looked at him. "You wash dishes?" "I can learn." Annie took her plate to the sink. "It's not flight training." Richard picked up 2 mugs. "That is encouraging." Sarah handed him a dish towel. "Dry. Don't reorganize my cabinets." "Yes, ma'am." For 10 quiet minutes, the 3 of them moved around the small kitchen. Annie washed, Richard dried. Sarah put things away because she did not trust either of them to know where anything went. It was ordinary, and that was what made Annie's chest ache. She had spent years imagining that finding her father would be a thunderclap. Instead, here he was, drying a chipped plate carefully because Sarah had told him not to break her good one. When the dishes were done, Richard went to the living room and returned with something Annie had not noticed at first. A flat envelope, large enough for a photograph. "I brought one thing," he said quickly. "Not expensive." "I should have asked." Sarah leaned against the counter. "Depends what it is." Richard looked at Annie. "The photograph from the leather briefcase. I had a copy restored. The original is still with me. But I thought you should have this." He handed the envelope to Annie. She opened it slowly. Inside was the photograph of Maya and Richard by the lakeside porch, cleaned of age but not changed. Maya's smile remained the same. Richard looked younger, unguarded, standing close to her but not touching her, as if the space between them had once been full of something only they understood. Annie carried the picture to the sideboard and placed it beside the photograph from her wallet. For the first time, the 2 images stood together without anyone crying, arguing, or explaining. Sarah came to Annie's side. "She looks happy there." Annie nodded. "She does." Richard stayed back. "I don't know if that makes it better or worse." "Both," Annie said. He accepted that. "Both, then." Annie looked at the 2 photographs for a long time. One had kept Maya close to a daughter. One had kept her close to a man who had failed her. Neither picture told the whole truth alone. Together, they did not fix the past, but they refused to let it stay broken in silence. Annie touched her bracelet. "She kept it all those years." Richard's voice was quiet. "Because she loved you before I was brave enough to." The words entered the room and stayed there. Sarah looked down, blinking fast. "That's the first thing you've said today worth putting in a frame." Richard gave a small, sad smile. I'll try not to ruin it by talking too much. Annie turned from the photographs. She studied him, this man who was her father by blood, and still a stranger by habit. She saw his caution, his regret, his hope trying not to ask too loudly. She also saw the empty years, the birthdays, the school forms, Maya's grave, Sarah's hands working when they should have rested. I'm not ready to call you Dad every day, Annie said. Richard's face changed, but he did not step toward her. I understand. I might not be ready for a long time. I understand that too. I need you not to make every visit feel like a test. I won't. And don't bring money into every problem. I'll try. Annie raised an eyebrow. Richard corrected himself. I won't. Sarah made a satisfied sound from the counter. Annie looked back at the photographs, then toward the table where breakfast still smelled faintly of coffee and biscuits. The house felt different from the apartment. But Sarah was here. Maya was here in the ways a memory can be. Richard was here because Annie had allowed it, not because anyone had bought the right. She drew a breath. But you can come for breakfast again, she said. Richard's eyes filled, and this time Annie did not look away. I'd like that, he said. Sarah picked up the coffee pot. Then you can start by learning how we do Sundays. No business talk before noon. No reporters. No lawyers. No tragic speeches while I'm eating. Richard nodded, understood. And next time, Sarah added, bring jam. Annie smiled. She likes peach. I'll remember, Richard said. They returned to the table because Sarah insisted nobody had eaten enough. Richard sat across from Annie, not claiming a place, only accepting the one offered. Outside the kitchen window, the tomato plants leaned slightly in the morning sun. A car passed slowly down the street. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked, and a neighbor called a greeting from a porch. The world did not become perfect. It did not owe them that. Maya was still gone. The years were still gone. Annie still had questions that would not all find answers. Richard still had apologies he would have to live, rather than repeat. Sarah still watched him with the careful eye of a woman who knew love was proven in habits, not moments. But the old leather briefcase no longer sat between them. The money, the gates, the reporters, the family name, all of that had been left outside for one morning. Inside the small kitchen, there was coffee cooling in cups, sunlight on the floor, 2 photographs of Maya side by side, and a silver bracelet on Annie's wrist. Annie reached for a biscuit, broke it in half, and passed one piece to Richard. It was not forgiveness. Not yet, but it was a beginning. The lesson of Annie's story is that truth may arrive late, but it still has the power to heal what silence has broken. A simple act of honesty, returning a forgotten leather briefcase, opened the door to a buried past, a lost father, and a mother's dignity finally being restored. The story reminds us that money cannot buy forgiveness, family is not built by blood alone, and real love must be proven through courage, respect, and the willingness to make things right. Most of all, it teaches that no person, no matter how poor or overlooked, should ever be treated as less worthy of the truth. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real, and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.